unlock the doors to terror as we venture into the ancient wilderness of the Appalachian Trail. From North Carolina to Maine, these 2,190 miles hide secrets darker than the deepest forest shadows. Today, we're counting down 11 of the most disturbing encounters ever reported by hikers who dared to walk this legendary path. Some returned forever changed. Others never returned at all. The rain started as small droplets tapping lightly against Miles Novak's weathered hiking jacket. At first, he welcomed the cool respite from the summer heat that had tormented him all day on the trail. But the sky darkened rapidly, transforming from gentle gray to a menacing charcoal as the distant rumble of thunder warned of the coming deluge. Miles checked his GPS, still 3 miles from the campsite he'd planned to reach before sunset. The storm wouldn't wait that long. He quickened his pace along the narrow forest path, scanning the increasingly slippery terrain for shelter. The wind picked up, bending the tall pines that surrounded him like sailors bracing against a gale. Rain now fell in earnest, sharp and cold against his face. His boots sank deeper into the softening earth with each step. Just as visibility dropped to mere yards ahead, a structure materialized through the curtain of rain, a small wooden cabin, its dark silhouette barely visible among the trees. The shelter wasn't marked on his trail map. Miles circled it once, finding no Park Service insignia, no information board, nothing to indicate its purpose. Just a simple wooden structure with a small covered porch, a door, and 2 windows with their shutters drawn closed. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the clearing for a split second, and Miles made his decision. He pushed against the door, surprised when it swung open with barely a sound. Inside, the air hung still and cold. Miles fumbled for his flashlight, the beam cutting through darkness to reveal a Spartan interior, a small table with 1 chair, a wooden bench along the far wall, and a stone fireplace that looked as though it hadn't seen flame in years. No decorations adorned the walls, no signs explaining the cabin's purpose. Just bare, rough-hewn timber that seemed to absorb both light and sound. He shrugged off his backpack and jacket, both soaked through, and hung them on a rusted hook by the door. The storm intensified outside, rain hammering against the roof like impatient fingers. Miles gathered what little dry wood was stacked beside the fireplace, and soon had a small fire crackling, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Something about those shadows seemed wrong. They moved not quite in rhythm with the flames, stretching and contracting as if possessing their own will. Miles dismissed the thought, attributing it to exhaustion from his 14-mile hike. He pulled out his trail mix and water bottle, settling on the bench to eat while the worst of the storm passed. That's when he first heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it beneath the thunder and rain. A whisper, unintelligible but distinctly human, seeming to emanate from the wall behind him. Miles froze, granola halfway to his mouth, and turned slowly toward the sound. Nothing but wooden planks greeted him. "Hello?" he called out, feeling foolish immediately. The cabin was empty. He checked every corner when he arrived. No response came except the crackle of his small fire and the ongoing assault of rain outside. Miles laughed nervously at his jumpiness and returned to his meal. Yet the sensation of not being alone persisted, prickling at the back of his neck like spider legs. The whispers returned as darkness claimed the forest completely. No longer could Miles dismiss them as imagination. Words formed in the hushed tones, fragmented phrases that slipped between the sounds of the storm. "Stay with us." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Miles lurched to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. He spun in place, flashlight beam jerking across the walls. "Who's there?" His voice sounded thin and frightened, even to his own ears. No answer came, but in the silence between thunderclaps, he could swear the wood itself was breathing. The firelight caught the grain patterns on the walls, and for a terrible moment, they appeared to shift like facial features, countless faces pressed against the wood as if trapped beneath its surface. Miles backed toward the door, every instinct screaming for him to flee. But the storm still raged outside, now accompanied by hail that clattered against the roof like thrown pebbles. He was trapped between dangers known and unknown. With shaking hands, he checked his phone. No signal, as expected this deep in the wilderness. The battery indicator showed 18% remaining. His flashlight flickered once, twice, a warning of its own failing power. Miles swallowed hard and made a decision. He would stay until the storm passed, no matter what tricks his mind played on him. He didn't notice, as he settled back onto the bench, how the chair at the table had turned slightly to face him, though he'd touched nothing in the cabin but the firewood. He didn't see how the shadows behind him stretched impossibly, forming humanoid shapes that reached toward him with elongated fingers. But he felt the temperature drop suddenly, his breath fogging in front of his face despite the fire's warmth. And he heard, distinct and terrible, a voice whisper directly into his ear. "We've waited so long for company." The firelight dimmed without explanation, plunging the cabin into near darkness. Miles fumbled for his flashlight, fingers clumsy with fear. The beam, weaker now, revealed nothing unusual, just the same bare walls, the same sparse furniture. Yet something fundamental had changed about the shelter, as if it had awakened to his presence. The wooden planks seemed to breathe in and out with subtle movement. The corners of the room appeared deeper, darker, stretching beyond what the dimensions of the cabin should allow. Miles pressed himself against the bench, trying to convince himself this was all exhaustion and isolation playing tricks on his perception. He'd been hiking alone for 3 days already, pushing himself too hard. Sensory deprivation could cause hallucinations. He'd read about that somewhere. Yet no psychological explanation accounted for the cold spot that moved deliberately across the room toward him, or for the distinct impression of fingers brushing across his shoulder when nothing was there. The whispers multiplied, becoming a chorus of voices with different tones and cadences, men, women, perhaps even children, all speaking at once yet somehow remaining individually distinct. Miles couldn't understand most of what they said. The words sounded like a language almost familiar but impossibly ancient. But phrases emerged with chilling clarity. "Join us, never leave, become part of forever." The voices seemed to emanate from the very structure of the shelter, as if the wood itself had absorbed the essence of those who had sought refuge here before. Miles grabbed his still damp jacket and backpack, storm be damned. As he moved toward the door, the whispers grew frantic, angry. The wooden planks creaked and groaned as if the entire structure were contracting around him. His hand reached for the door handle, and found nothing. Where the exit had been now stood solid wall, unbroken timber without seam or crack. Miles spun around, disoriented. The interior of the cabin seemed to have rearranged itself, the dimensions wrong, the fireplace now on the adjacent wall. Panic seized him. He pounded against what should have been the door, his fists striking unyielding wood. "Let me out!" he shouted, voice breaking. In response, the whispers rose to a crescendo, no longer attempting human language but expressing a hunger that transcended words. The cabin's interior darkened further as the fire died completely, though Miles had seen plenty of wood remaining. In the sudden darkness, his flashlight beam caught movement along the walls, not shadows but the wood itself rippling like water. Faces began to emerge from the grain, pushing outward as if trying to break through from some impossible space beyond. Hands formed in the wooden surfaces, reaching toward him with grotesque, elongated fingers. Miles screamed, backing away until he hit the opposite wall, only to feel it give slightly behind him, like flesh rather than timber. The wall embraced him, pulling him backward with inexorable force. Miles thrashed and fought as the wood softened, becoming almost liquid around his struggling form. His flashlight fell from his grasp, rolling across the floor to illuminate the horror from below. The wooden surfaces throughout the cabin now teemed with partially formed human shapes, hundreds of them pressing outward, their features twisted in expressions of both agony and ecstasy. "Please," Miles gasped. "I don't belong here." His words drew mocking laughter from the whispers, which now spoke in unison. "Neither did we once." Something grabbed his ankle, another hand emerging from the floorboards. Miles kicked free and lunged toward the fallen flashlight, his only connection to rationality in this nightmare. As his fingers closed around it, the beam caught something tucked in a corner, a small leather-bound book he hadn't noticed before. Acting on instinct, Miles crawled toward it, fighting against the pull of the animated wood that tore at his clothing and skin. The book fell open at his touch. Scrawled handwriting covered every page, journal entries dating back decades, each in different hands but all telling variations of the same story. Hikers, hunters, lost travelers, each seeking shelter from storms across the years. Each writing frantically as the shelter revealed its true nature. Each ending mid-sentence as they were claimed by the living wood. And now Miles understood with crystal clarity. The shelter hadn't been built to protect humans from the wilderness. It had been grown to harvest them. Outside, unnoticed by Miles, the storm had passed. Moonlight filtered through the trees, illuminating the small clearing where nothing stood except ancient forest. No cabin, no structure of any kind. Only a circle of mushrooms marked the spot, a fairy ring centuries old. And deep beneath the earth, roots stretched for miles in every direction, feeding on the essence of those they had lured and claimed across generations. The forest grew lush and impossibly verdant around the clearing, nourished by those who had sought safety within its false embrace. Miles wrote frantically in the journal he'd found, documenting everything as the cabin's transformation accelerated around him. His hand trembled, making his already messy handwriting nearly illegible. The walls pulsed now like a massive heart, the wood grain flowing like blood vessels. The faces had become more defined, men and women of varying ages, wearing clothing from different eras. Their eyes followed his movements with desperate hunger. The floor beneath him softened further, his body sinking inch by inch into what felt like warm quicksand. The consistency was wrong, not like mud or water, but something organic that pulled with deliberate intent. Miles tried to keep the journal above the encroaching wood, determined that someone might find it, might understand what happened here. But who would find it? The shelter appeared only to those who needed it, only during storms, only to the vulnerable and isolated. As the wood enveloped his legs completely, Miles noticed something extraordinary happening. His terror began to fade, replaced by a strange sense of communion with the others trapped within the shelter. Their thoughts flowed into his, centuries of consciousness preserved within the living structure. They had been afraid too, once. Now they were part of something vast and ancient, something that had existed long before humans walked these forests. The whispers changed tenor, becoming almost soothing. The first moments hurt, they told him. Then you become something greater. Miles felt his resistance weakening, not from physical exhaustion but from a creeping fascination with what awaited him. The pain where the wood merged with his flesh was already dulling, replaced by a tingling warmth that spread through his body. Through the collective consciousness now seeping into his mind, Miles learned the truth. The entity they were becoming part of wasn't malevolent in any human sense. It simply existed, fed, and grew according to its nature. It offered a kind of immortality, consciousness preserved though transformed. His individual self would dissolve gradually, becoming one note in a vast chorus that experienced time in ways humans couldn't comprehend. The journal slipped from his fingers as the wood claimed his arms. Miles watched with detached interest as it fell into the floor, absorbed like everything else. His last independent thought was to wonder who would be next, and when. The storm season was just beginning. Someone else would come seeking shelter eventually. 3 weeks later, Ranger Caroline Herrera noted an unusually lush section of forest during her patrol. Something about the clearing with its perfect circle of mushrooms caught her attention. According to her GPS, she'd never patrolled this exact spot before, though she'd crossed this section of the park hundreds of times. She made a note to return and investigate further when her shift ended. That afternoon, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The weather service hadn't predicted rain, but mountain weather was notoriously unpredictable. Caroline sighed, calculating the distance back to her vehicle, too far to reach before the storm hit. She'd need to find shelter soon. As the first lightning bolt split the sky, she thought she glimpsed something through the trees ahead, the welcoming silhouette of a small wooden cabin, exactly where she needed it to be. The hazy morning light filtered through the dense canopy of oak and maple trees as Clara Reynolds adjusted her 40-pound backpack. 6 days into her solo through hike of the Appalachian Trail, her muscles had settled into a comfortable rhythm of constant movement. The dappled sunlight played across her face as she navigated the rocky terrain, her hiking poles clicking against stone in a meditative cadence that matched her breathing. She'd left civilization behind to find herself in the wilderness, a walking meditation after her divorce had upended her carefully constructed life back in Boston. The trail wound through a particularly remote section today, far from road crossings and established campsites. Clara had seen only 2 other hikers since dawn, a retired couple heading southbound who'd passed her with cheerful waves 3 hours ago. This solitude was exactly what she'd sought when planning her 3-month adventure. The forest embraced her like an old friend, offering quiet companionship as she processed the emotional wreckage of the past year. When the trail crested at a scenic overlook around midday, Clara paused to drink in the sweeping vista of undulating green mountains stretching to the horizon. She shrugged off her pack and sat on a sun-warmed rock, pulling out her trail journal. The pages were filling with observations about birds, weather patterns, and the gradual unburdening of her heart with each mile traveled. The loneliness that had haunted her city life seemed to evaporate in these mountains, replaced by a profound sense of connection with something larger than herself. Her peaceful contemplation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Looking up, Clara spotted a man in his 40s coming up the trail, carrying what appeared to be a small cooler. He wore hiking clothes but lacked the weathered look of most long-distance hikers. His fresh clothes and clean-shaven face suggested he'd come from a nearby access point. He smiled broadly when he saw her. "Perfect timing, I was hoping to find some hungry hikers up here today," he called out cheerfully. "I'm Craig. I live about 2 miles down that service road and come up a couple times a month with trail magic for you brave souls." Clara returned his smile, feeling a rush of appreciation. Trail angels, people who provided unexpected kindness to hikers, were legendary on the At. "That's incredibly kind of you. I'm Clara." Craig set down his cooler and opened it with a flourish. Inside were sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, fresh fruit, homemade cookies, and cold drinks beating with condensation. "Help yourself to whatever looks good. I made everything fresh this morning." The sandwich, thick-cut turkey with avocado and sprouts on homemade bread, tasted like heaven after days of rehydrated meals and protein bars. Clara savored each bite, making appreciative noises that made Craig beam with pride. They chatted easily about the trail, the weather, and the wildlife in the area. He seemed knowledgeable about the mountains, pointing out distant peaks and sharing local history. Something shifted subtly when Clara mentioned she was hiking alone. Craig's expression flickered with an emotion she couldn't quite place before his smile returned. "A woman as pretty as you shouldn't be out here by herself," he said, his tone light but his eyes suddenly watchful. "Dangerous things happen in these woods." An uncomfortable prickle ran down Clara's spine, but she dismissed it. Trail angels were by definition kind souls, and she'd encountered plenty of people with outdated views about women hiking solo. She steered the conversation towards safer territory, asking about his home nearby. Craig's enthusiasm returned as he described his cabin. "It's nothing fancy, but it's got running water and a real shower. You're welcome to stop by to clean up if you want. Most hikers jump at the chance for a hot shower." Clara took a long drink from the water bottle he provided, suddenly feeling strangely heavy-limbed and foggy. The sandwich sat in her stomach like a stone. Her vision blurred slightly at the edges as Craig continued talking, his words beginning to sound distant and echoey. "Not feeling well?" he asked, moving closer. His concerned expression seemed to waver and stretch before her eyes. "Maybe you should rest at my place for a bit. It's not far." Alarm bells rang dimly through the gathering haze in Clara's mind as she tried to stand but found her legs unresponsive. The realization dawned with horrible clarity. Something had been in that food or drink. Craig watched her struggling, no longer bothering to maintain his friendly facade. His smile now looked predatory as the forest around them began to spin. The morning birdsong had long faded when Clara's consciousness clawed its way back through layers of chemical-induced fog. Her mouth felt desert dry, her thoughts fragmented like shattered glass. She was being moved, her body limp and unresponsive as strong arms carried her through undergrowth off the Maine Trail. Through half-closed eyelids, she glimpsed Craig's profile, his earlier friendliness replaced by grim determination as he navigated down a barely visible path. Pain radiated from her shoulders where they dug into his collarbone with each jolting step. The rational part of her mind that wasn't clouded by whatever drug he'd given her catalogued her situation with clinical detachment. Abducted in broad daylight by someone posing as a trail angel. No one knew she was here. No one would miss her for days, maybe weeks. The knowledge settled like ice in her veins. Clara fought against the chemical restraints binding her consciousness, trying to force her limbs to respond. A small moan escaped her lips, the most her body would allow. Craig stopped immediately, his head snapping down to study her face. "Almost home now," he murmured, his voice eerily gentle. "You're going to be my guest for a while." The path opened into a small clearing where a rustic cabin stood, far more isolated than Clara had imagined when he mentioned his home. No neighbors, no passing traffic, just wilderness stretching in all directions. A flash of metal caught her eye, chains on the porch posts. Her heart stuttered with terror as she glimpsed what looked like scratch marks on the wooden door frame, as though someone, or many someones, had tried to claw their way out. Craig kicked open the door and carried her inside. The cabin's interior was sparsely furnished but meticulously clean. Most disturbing was a wall covered with photographs, dozens of them, all of women on the trail. Some appeared candid, taken from a distance, while others showed women smiling with Craig, accepting food or drinks. Clara's blood ran cold as she realized she wasn't his first victim. She was merely the latest in what appeared to be a long-established pattern. "You'll understand eventually," Craig said conversationally as he laid her on a narrow bed in the corner. "The wilderness isn't meant for women alone. I'm protecting you, really." He secured her wrists to the bed frame with practiced movements, the restraints padded but inescapable. "The others fought at first too, but they came to appreciate what I've built here." Clara's mind raced through her options, each more desperate than the last. Her pack, with her phone, emergency beacon, and knife, was still at the overlook. No one knew where she was. The drug was still circulating in her system, making coordinated movement impossible. But beneath the terror, a cold, hard resolve began to form. She hadn't survived a devastating divorce and rebuilt her life just to die in this monster's cabin. As Craig moved around the small space, preparing what looked horrifyingly like a permanent space for her, Clara focused on wiggling her fingers and toes, fighting to regain control of her extremities. The drug was wearing off, but not quickly enough. She needed to buy time, to make him believe she was still incapacitated while her mind worked frantically on an escape plan. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Craig glanced toward the window and frowned. "Storm's coming sooner than forecast. Need to secure some things outside before it hits." He checked her restraints one more time before heading to the door. "Don't go anywhere," he added with a twisted smile at his own joke. The moment the door closed behind him, Clara redoubled her efforts to move. The sedative's effects were receding from her extremities first, and she could now flex her hands and feet. The restraints were professional-grade medical cuffs, padded to prevent marks but secured to the bed frame with heavy chains. Tears of frustration burned in her eyes as she twisted her wrists, seeking any weakness in the bindings. A flash of lightning illuminated the cabin interior, drawing Clara's attention to something she hadn't noticed before, a small key hanging on a hook near the kitchen area. If she could somehow reach it. But the distance seemed impossible from her restrained position. The storm intensified outside, rain beginning to pelt against the windows as Craig's shadowy figure moved around the property, securing outdoor equipment. Then Clara spotted something else, a hiking boot knife partially visible beneath the adjacent bed frame, perhaps dropped by a previous victim. If she could stretch far enough with her foot. The effort made her muscles scream in protest, but determination fueled her movements as her toes inched closer to the potential weapon. Freedom and survival lay just centimeters from her grasp as the cabin door creaked, signaling Craig's imminent return. The knife blade glinted in the stormlight like a promise. Clara's heart pounded against her ribs with a primitive rhythm, the desperate percussion of prey refusing to become a victim. She had seconds, not minutes, to determine whether she would become just another photograph on Craig's wall of trophies or the woman who escaped. Outside, footsteps approached the cabin door as Clara made her choice, muscles coiling with newfound strength born of absolute necessity. The storm had intensified to a blinding deluge by the time Craig re-entered the cabin, rainwater streaming from his hair and clothes. The momentary flash of lightning that accompanied his entrance gave Clara the cover she needed, that split second when his vision would be adjusting from the bright flash to the cabin's dimness. She'd managed to slide the knife under her leg, concealing it from his immediate view as she tracked his movements with half-closed eyes, feigning continued sedation. "Weather's getting nasty out there," Craig remarked, seemingly to himself as he shrugged off his wet jacket. "Good thing I found you when I did. Storms like this can be deadly on exposed ridgelines." He moved about the cabin with disturbing domesticity, lighting a kerosene lamp as thunder rattled the windows. The yellow light cast grotesque shadows across the photographic shrine to his previous victims, their faces watching Clara with silent warning. He approached the bed where she lay, sitting on its edge with proprietary confidence. "The sedative should be wearing off soon. You'll probably be hungry again." His hand reached out to brush hair from her face with perverse tenderness. "I always take good care of my guests." Clara forced herself to remain still beneath his touch, though every fiber of her being recoiled. She needed perfect timing. The knife pressed against her thigh was her only chance, but wielding it would require strength she wasn't sure she'd regained. Craig's fingers traced down her cheek to her neck, his touch lingering over her pulse point. A smile spread across his face as he felt her heart rate quicken. You're more awake than you're pretending to be," he said softly. "That's good. I prefer when they're conscious for this part." In that moment, Clara realized she couldn't wait any longer. As his hand moved toward her throat, she summoned every ounce of strength and slashed upward with the knife. The blade caught him across the forearm, drawing a startled howl of pain and surprise. Blood sprayed across the bedsheets as he jerked backward, his expression morphing from controlled confidence to rage. "You ungrateful bitch!" Craig lunged at her, but the injury had thrown him off balance. Clara kicked out with both feet, catching him squarely in the chest and sending him crashing into the wall of photographs. Dozens of smiling faces rained down around him as frames shattered on the floor. The restraints limited Clara's movement, but adrenaline surged through her system, burning away the last effects of the sedative. She slashed at the padded cuffs, the knife's edge finding purchase on the fabric covering but struggling against the reinforced interior. Craig was regaining his footing, his eyes wild with fury as blood streamed down his arm. "You can't leave," he snarled, grabbing a heavy flashlight from a nearby shelf. "None of you ever leave." Clara abandoned her attempt to cut the restraints and instead focused on the chains securing them to the bed frame. The old metal links were the weak point in Craig's system. She hacked at them frantically as he advanced, the knife's edge scraping and catching on rusted iron. A tremendous crack of lightning struck somewhere very close, momentarily flooding the cabin with blinding light. The subsequent thunder was immediate and deafening, and accompanied by the splintering crash of a tree falling onto the cabin's roof. Timber and roofing crashed inward as a massive branch punched through the ceiling, sending Craig diving for cover. In that chaotic moment, Clara's knife found purchase between two chain links, and with a desperate twist, the metal gave way. One hand free, she frantically worked on the second restraint as the cabin groaned around them. Rain poured through the broken roof, drenching everything as Craig crawled toward her, determination etched in every line of his face despite the destruction surrounding them. "You belong here now," he rasped, reaching for her ankle. "With the others. Under the floorboards." The horror of his words gave Clara renewed strength. With a final wrench, the second chain snapped. She rolled away from his grasping hands, landing in a defensive crouch on the far side of the bed, knife extended before her. Rain plastered her hair to her face as she backed toward what remained of the door, never taking her eyes off the man who had nearly added her to his collection. Craig rose slowly, calculating. "There's nowhere to go," he said, gesturing toward the storm-ravaged forest outside. "You'll die out there without supplies. At least here you could live." "Like they did?" Clara spat, gesturing toward the fallen photographs with her knife. "I'd rather take my chances with the storm." The mist clung to the treetops of Blackwood Forest like spectral fingers as Michael Reeves pulled his ranger jacket tighter around his shoulders. 23 years as a Boy Scout troop leader, and he still couldn't shake the chill that settled in his bones when he recounted that day. The digital recorder on the table between us blinked steadily as he stared through the window of the ranger station, his eyes fixed on the jagged ridgeline where it happened, where Troop 192 lost 3 of its own. "We called it a routine hike in the report," Michael began, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd rehearsed this story countless times in his mind but rarely spoken it aloud. "June 17, 2011. Clear skies, 68 degrees. Perfect conditions." His weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug emblazoned with the faded scout emblem. 12 boys, 3 parent volunteers, and myself. We'd done Echo Ridge a dozen times before. The photographs spread across the table showed smiling faces beneath green berets: Kyle Winters, Mark Ellington, and Toby Chin, all 14 years old, their badges gleaming in the morning sun. These were the last images taken before they vanished. In the background of one photo, almost imperceptible unless you knew to look, was the rock formation locals called the Sentinel. Its smooth granite face rose from the forest floor like an ancient monolith, undisturbed for millennia except by wind and rain. "The boys were in high spirits that day," Michael continued, pointing to a topo map marked with their intended route. "Kyle had just earned his Eagle Scout rank. Mark and Toby were close behind. They were inseparable, the 3 musketeers, we called them." His finger traced the dotted line that wound up the eastern slope. "We left at 0900 hours. Standard procedure, buddy system, hourly check-ins, clear sight lines maintained between groups." The forest around Echo Ridge had always been dense, but nothing extraordinary by wilderness standards. Native Shoshone legends spoke of thin places in these mountains, where the membrane between worlds supposedly weakened, but such tales were relegated to campfire stories, not safety briefings. Perhaps they should have been. "First 2 hours were textbook," Michael said, his gaze hardening as he approached the moment everything changed. "We stopped at Copper Creek for lunch. I remember checking my watch, 12:17 p.m. The 3 musketeers asked if they could explore a small clearing about 50 yards ahead while we prepared the meal. I gave them 15 minutes, told them not to go beyond shouting distance." The ranger station fell silent except for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the occasional static from the radio. Outside, the forest seemed to lean closer, as if it too wanted to hear what came next. 13 minutes later, Mrs. Ellington, Mark's mother, asked where the boys were. I wasn't concerned yet. They were reliable kids, never late for check-in. I called out their names. Michael's voice cracked slightly. When they didn't answer, we formed a search line. That's when we found their tracks. What they discovered defied logical explanation. 3 sets of boot prints, easily identifiable by the distinct tread patterns of Scout-issued hiking boots, led in a straight line toward the Sentinel's northern face. The prints showed no signs of struggle, no indication of fear or flight, just 3 boys walking purposefully toward solid rock. The tracks just stopped at the rock face, like they'd walked straight into it. Michael's fingers trembled as he slid a photograph across the table, 3 sets of prints ending abruptly at the vertical granite surface. We searched for days. Brought in dogs, helicopters, thermal imaging. Nothing. The volunteer search that began that afternoon swelled to over 300 people within 48 hours. The case attracted national attention, spawning theories ranging from practical hidden caves, optical illusions to conspiratorial government experiments, extraterrestrial abduction. Every inch of the Sentinel was examined, core samples taken, ground-penetrating radar employed. The rock revealed nothing but its ancient, impenetrable self. "You know what haunts me most?" Michael whispered, almost to himself. "The boot prints. They didn't veer off or scatter. They didn't show hesitation. Whatever those boys saw, or thought they saw, they walked toward it together, in perfect confidence, like they were being welcomed home." The forest grew darker outside the station window, shadows deepening among the trees. But the true darkness, I realized, had never left Michael Reeves since that summer day. It lived in his eyes, in the slight tremor of his hands, in the cautious way he glanced toward the mountains where 3 boys had simply ceased to exist, leaving nothing behind but footprints that led nowhere, and everywhere. The search for the missing scouts transformed the sleepy town of Pinecrest. What began as a community rallying to find 3 lost boys evolved into something far more complex, a phenomenon that peeled back the veneer of ordinary life to reveal the strange beneath. I followed Michael as he trudged up the now infamous trail, each step heavy with memory. "After the official search was suspended, I kept coming back," he said, navigating the path with muscle memory. "Every weekend for 3 years. Then monthly. Now." He paused, gesturing vaguely. "Special occasions. Birthdays. Anniversaries." The forest had reclaimed much of what the search parties had disturbed. Yellow police tape, once wrapped around trees like morbid streamers, had long since been removed. But the sentinel remained, immutable and indifferent. The morning light cast long shadows across its face, creating illusions that might, to desperate eyes, resemble doorways or passages. "People sent theories from all over the world," Michael continued as we approached the site. "Geologists suggested undiscovered cave systems beneath the rock. Physicists wrote about quantum displacement. Ministers offered prayers for lost souls. Psychics claimed to have spoken with the boys in another dimension." His voice carried no mockery, only the exhaustion of a man who had considered every possibility, no matter how improbable. The clearing where the boys disappeared appeared unremarkable, a small break in the forest canopy, sunlight dappling the pine needle floor. Yet standing there, I felt a peculiar pressure, as if the air had thickened. Michael noticed my discomfort, his expression suggesting familiar recognition. "You feel it too," he said. Not a question. Since the disappearance, dozens of hikers, researchers, and curiosity seekers had reported similar sensations in this clearing: a subtle disorientation, watches temporarily malfunctioning, compasses spinning before settling. Most scientists attributed these experiences to psychological suggestion, the power of expectation. Yet others, including several university research teams, documented unexplainable magnetic anomalies that existed nowhere else on the ridge. "The parents handled it differently," Michael said, carefully skirting the exact spot where the footprints had ended. "The Chens moved away within the year. Couldn't bear the sideways glances at the grocery store, the pitying smiles. The Winters threw themselves into advocacy, started a foundation for wilderness safety. But the Ellingtons..." He trailed off, eyes fixed on the rock face. Karen Ellington's story became almost as famous as the disappearance itself. Mark's mother began camping at the base of the Sentinel just weeks after the search was called off. She claimed to hear her son's laughter in the wind, insisted she could feel his presence strongest at twilight. Her husband eventually left, unable to watch her gradual detachment from reality. "She told me she saw them once," Michael said, voice dropping to a near whisper. "All 3 boys standing just there, transparent like heat waves over asphalt." He pointed to the rock face. "She said they were smiling, trying to show her something. After that sighting, she seemed at peace. Stopped camping out here. Said the boys weren't lost, they were somewhere else, somewhere wonderful." Karen died of cancer 3 years later. In her final diary entry, she wrote she was going to find her boy in the in-between places. The Ellington family buried an empty casket beside hers, finally accepting that Mark would never return in any form they could embrace. What remained were questions that burrowed into the community like roots, persistent, unseen, gradually altering the foundation. Did the forest hold other thin places? Had there been previous disappearances, forgotten or unconnected? The regional archives revealed at least 7 similar cases over the past century. Lone hikers or small groups whose tracks simply ended, as if they'd been lifted from the earth. "Look here," Michael said, kneeling beside a small cairn of stones near the rock face. "This wasn't here last month." He carefully dismantled it, revealing 3 small objects underneath: a polished Eagle Scout medal, a chess piece, a knight, and a folded origami crane. Kyle was awarded his Eagle rank posthumously. Mark was the chess club champion. And Toby made these paper cranes for everyone's birthday. As Michael's weathered hands hovered over these artifacts, I realized they weren't just memorials but messages, not unlike flowers left at a grave. But who had placed them? The parents were gone or had moved away. Most of the former scouts had left for college or military service. The offerings seemed recent, untouched by weather. "Sometimes I think," Michael began, then stopped himself, reconstructing the cairn with methodical care. "Sometimes I think they found something wonderful. Not terrible. Not an ending." His eyes, when they met mine, held a strange luminosity. "The night after they disappeared, I dreamed of them. All 3 walking into a forest filled with impossible light, like dawn and sunset happening simultaneously. They looked back once, and Kyle, he was always the leader, he said, 'It's okay, Mr. Reeves. We found the way through.'" The wind picked up suddenly, sending pine needles spiraling around us. For just a moment, in that swirling debris, patterns emerged that resembled 3 slender figures, hands linked, faces turned toward adventure. Then just as quickly, they dispersed, leaving nothing but ordinary forest and the persistent shadow of the sentinel, keeper of secrets it showed only to those it chose. The sentinel seemed to watch us as we made our silent trek back down the trail. 3 hours at the site had yielded no new insights, only the familiar ache of unresolved loss. But as we neared the ranger station, Michael suddenly stopped, pulling a worn leather journal from his pocket. "I've never shown this to the investigators," he said, voice tight with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "Scout leaders keep field notes. Observations, wildlife sightings, teachable moments. This was my journal from that week." The pages he opened to contain standard entries, equipment checks, weather observations, merit badge progress. But in the margins of the page dated 2 days before the disappearance were peculiar sketches, concentric circles with angular symbols between the rings, meticulously rendered in black ink. "Kyle drew these during our campfire the night before the hike," Michael explained. "Said he'd been dreaming about them for weeks. I thought they were just doodles." His finger traced the intricate pattern. "After everything happened, I found identical markings carved into a fallen log near where they vanished. Fresh cuts. Same pattern." Later analysis by linguistics professors identified elements resembling Proto-Shoshone symbols mixed with what appeared to be mathematical equations. Some suggested they represented star mapping coordinates or topographical features. Others saw only the imagination of a creative teenager. But the identical carvings at the site raised questions no one could comfortably answer. "There's something else," Michael continued, turning to another page. "Toby's dad gave me his son's journal after the search ended. Toby had written about seeing people made of light watching him from the trees 3 nights before they disappeared. He wasn't scared of them. He wrote they were like scouts from another troop, waiting for us to join them." These details had been deliberately withheld from the media frenzy that followed the disappearance. The official investigation focused on probable causes, disorientation, hidden geological features, even foul play. But Michael and a small circle of witnesses harbored their private knowledge of the inexplicable elements surrounding the case. "Last year, a geology student doing research on the ridge found this." Michael handed me a small plastic bag containing what appeared to be a torn patch, the distinctive green border of a Scout merit badge. "Lab tests confirmed it was manufactured in 2010, consistent with our troop's badges. But she found it embedded in a rock core sample taken from inside the Sentinel. A sample dated to approximately 12,000 years ago. The scientific community dismissed it as contamination, a practical joke, or simple misidentification. The student who found it eventually recanted her report under professional pressure. But the patch remained, a physical impossibility that defied categorization. "I'm retiring next month," Michael said as we reached the ranger station, the sun now hanging low in the western sky. 25 years leading troops through these mountains. Never lost another scout." Pride and pain mingled in his voice. "But I've spent enough time searching. I think it's time to let them find me." He pulled a letter from his pocket, the paper worn thin from countless unfoldings. "This came 3 days ago. No return address." He handed it to me without explanation. Inside was a photograph, 3 middle-aged men standing arm in arm before what appeared to be an ancient stone archway covered in symbols identical to those in Michael's journal. Their faces were unmistakably older versions of Kyle, Mark, and Toby. Behind them, through the archway, was a landscape of impossible geography, floating islands, spiraling forests, dual suns. Written on the back in careful handwriting, "The trail goes both ways. Summer solstice. Dawn. The Sentinel remembers you." The summer solstice was 2 weeks away. "I don't know if it's elaborate cruelty or impossible truth," Michael said, his voice steady despite the implications. "But I'll be there at dawn. Maybe there are doors we don't see until we're ready to walk through them. Maybe time isn't what we think it is." As darkness settled over Blackwood Forest, Michael Reeves gazed out at the Sentinel's silhouette, black against the indigo sky. The disappearance of Troop 192's 3 members had never been solved by conventional means. Perhaps because the answer lay beyond convention, in the realm where footprints lead into solid rock, where ancient stone holds modern artifacts, and where lost boys might simply be taking the long way home through doorways visible only to those with the courage to see them. The recorder between us clicked off, having reached its capacity. But some stories continue long after the telling ends, living in the spaces between established facts, in the whispers of wind through pine boughs, in the persistent hope that what appears to be an ending might actually be a beginning, waiting on the other side of stone. The morning sun painted long shadows across the Appalachian Trail as Marcus Reinhardt shouldered his pack for another day of hiking. 63 days into his through hike, the path had become both home and highway. His world narrowed to the next white blaze and the rhythm of his trekking poles against stone. The shelter logbook lay open beside him, its pages documenting the transient community that flowed like water along the spine of the eastern mountains. Marcus scribbled his trail name, Pathfinder, and a quick note about yesterday's 15-mile push through unexpected rain. As he flipped through previous entries, a familiar handwriting caught his eye. Shadowfoot, mile 532. The same neat, precise lettering he'd seen at 3 shelters back. Nothing unusual there. Hikers often leapfrogged each other for hundreds of miles. But something about the timing made the hair on Marcus's neck stand up. It was the 5th consecutive shelter where their paths had crossed, yet he couldn't place which hiker Shadowfoot might be. The Blue Ridge Mountains rippled away beneath a tapestry of green as Marcus climbed out of the gap. His mind wandered back through faces at campsites, conversations shared over dinner. Most through hikers were memorable, each with distinctive gear, quirks, or stories. They formed fleeting but intense bonds, like stars burning bright before continuing their separate journeys across the night sky. But this Shadowfoot remained a ghost, present in the logbooks yet somehow invisible around campfires. That evening, as darkness pooled beneath the hemlocks, Marcus reached Blueberry Mountain Shelter, a simple 3-sided wooden structure facing a small fire ring. 4 other hikers were already settled, their sleeping bags unfurled like cocoons waiting for transformation. Marcus recognized 3 from previous shelters, a retired couple trail named Double Espresso, and a former software engineer called Reboot. The 4th sat slightly apart, hunched over a titanium cook pot. "Mind if I join?" Marcus asked, gesturing toward the empty space on the shelter platform. The unfamiliar hiker looked up, his face partially shadowed by a worn baseball cap. "Free country," he replied with neither enthusiasm nor hostility. Something about his equipment struck Marcus as carefully anonymous. No bright colors, no distinctive patches, nothing that would make him memorable in a hiker's mental catalog. That night, Marcus dreamed of being followed through endless green tunnels of rhododendron. He woke at dawn, body tense, to find the stranger's sleeping spot empty, pack gone. The shelter log showed a new entry. Shadowfoot, mile 597. The handwriting matched the previous instances, the realization hitting Marcus like ice water. He'd finally seen Shadowfoot, and the man had said nothing about their overlapping journey. What began as curiosity crystallized into unease as Marcus hiked through morning mist. Coincidences happened on the trail, but 5 consecutive shelter crossings without acknowledgement felt deliberate, like a hunter stalking prey. The wilderness, once a sanctuary, now seemed to conceal unknown threats behind each ridge and hollow. At McAfee Knob, one of the trail's most photographed spots, Marcus paused to admire the panoramic view that stretched like a promise of freedom. Other hikers clustered nearby, taking photos on the famous rock outcropping. As he scanned the friendly faces, a figure stood at the trail's edge, the same anonymous hiker, watching. When their eyes met, Shadowfoot turned and disappeared down the path before Marcus could approach. 3 days and 30 miles later, Marcus began cataloging patterns. Shadowfoot always arrived after him but departed before dawn. He spoke little to other hikers and never joined group conversations. His pace somehow matched Marcus's exactly despite never hiking alongside him. Most disturbing of all, he left no digital footprint. In an era when most hikers documented their journeys online, Shadowfoot existed only in shelter logbooks and fleeting glimpses. The Virginia highlands gave way to rolling farmlands as Marcus pushed harder each day, driven by growing paranoia. He varied his pace, took alternate routes, even skipped a planned 0-day in a trail town. Yet the signature kept appearing in logbooks, sometimes at shelters he'd randomly chosen at the last moment. The distance between them had shrunk from comfortable coincidence to calculated pursuit, creating a psychological weight heavier than any backpack Marcus had ever carried. The Blue Mountain shelter appeared through the trees as afternoon shadows lengthened across the forest floor. Marcus hesitated before approaching, scanning the clearing for any sign of his unwanted shadow. Finding no one, he claimed a spot and unshouldered his pack. His fingers trembled slightly as he untied his boots, the constant vigilance of recent days wearing on him like erosion on stone. The crunch of approaching footsteps sent a jolt through Marcus's exhausted body. He looked up to see a silhouette framed against the dimming light of the trail, Shadowfoot, right on schedule. The trail stretched endlessly before Marcus as dawn broke over the Shenandoah Valley. 87 days into his through hike, the initial joy of the journey had been contaminated by paranoia. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow between trees became Shadowfoot in his mind. The man had maintained his pattern with mechanical precision, arriving after Marcus at shelters, leaving before him, never initiating conversation yet somehow always there, like a dark star following its own inevitable orbit. Marcus had tried everything. He'd skipped shelters to camp alone, varied his mileage unpredictably, even taken impromptu Nero days in trail towns. Nothing worked. The signature would appear, sometimes at shelters he'd chosen on pure impulse. It defied logical explanation, as if Shadowfoot could predict his movements, anticipate his decisions before he made them. The psychological toll had transformed Marcus. Where once he chatted freely with fellow hikers, he now kept conversations brief, eyeing strangers with suspicion. His trail photos, once filled with scenic vistas and wildlife, now frequently captured distant figures that might or might not be his stalker. He'd lost weight beyond the usual. Hiker lean. His appetite diminished by constant stress. "You look like you've seen a ghost," remarked a southbound hiker at a water source. Marcus managed a tight smile, unwilling to share his situation. Who would believe him? Trail life was built on serendipitous meetings and parallel journeys. Claiming someone was stalking him would sound like wilderness-induced paranoia. That night at Pinefield Hut, Marcus made a decision. This had gone on long enough, over 500 miles of psychological torment. When Shadowfoot arrived, Marcus would confront him directly. The anticipation made his hands shake as he prepared his dinner, glancing repeatedly toward the trail entrance. Every snapped twig sent adrenaline coursing through his system, a prey animal awaiting the predator. Shadowfoot arrived as the first stars appeared, slipping into the shelter with the quiet efficiency Marcus had come to dread. 3 other hikers were already asleep, their soft snores a backdrop to the unfolding drama. Marcus watched as the man arranged his sleeping area with practiced movements, never once acknowledging Marcus's presence despite the obvious tension radiating between them. "Why are you following me?" Marcus finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper but cutting through the nighttime forest sounds like a blade. Shadowfoot's movements stilled. The silence stretched between them, elastic and dangerous, before he slowly raised his head. His eyes reflected the meager light of Marcus's headlamp. "I'm not following you," he said, each word deliberate and flat. "I'm hiking the Appalachian Trail, same as you. For 500 miles? Same shelters, same pace, never speaking?" Marcus pressed, careful not to wake the others. "That's not coincidence." Something shifted in Shadowfoot's expression, a subtle change that made Marcus's skin crawl. "Perhaps you're following me," he suggested, the hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Have you considered that possibility?" The question hung in the air like smoke, disorienting in its simple inversion of reality. Marcus felt his certainty waver for a heartbeat. Could he be wrong? Had his mind constructed a pattern where none existed? The doubt evaporated as quickly as it had formed. The logbooks didn't lie, nor did his documented timeline. "I'm getting off trail tomorrow," Marcus said, a decision formed in the crucible of that moment. "Taking a bus from Waynesboro. Whatever game you're playing ends now." Shadowfoot's expression remained neutral, but something cold slithered behind his eyes. "The trail provides what each hiker needs," he said cryptically. "Some need solitude, some companionship. Some need to be reminded they're not as alone as they think." The next morning, Marcus woke to find Shadowfoot gone, his sleeping area empty as always. The shelter logbook contained the familiar signature and nothing more. Marcus shouldered his pack with new determination and began the 12-mile hike to Waynesboro, his mind made up. He'd catch the eastbound bus, perhaps resume his hike further north after regaining his equilibrium. The forest seemed to press closer that day, the canopy blocking most of the sunlight. 4 miles from town, Marcus rounded a bend to find Shadowfoot sitting on a fallen log, facing the trail as if expecting him. Not hiking ahead, not behind, but waiting. For the first time in their strange, silent dance, he'd broken the pattern. "You won't make the afternoon bus," Shadowfoot said conversationally. "Might as well continue to the next shelter. I hear it has a great view." The blood in Marcus's veins turned to ice. He hadn't told anyone about his plans to leave, had only decided last night. The implications spread through his consciousness like ink in water. Either Shadowfoot had been close enough to overhear his whispered conversation, or worse, somehow knew his thoughts. Both possibilities were equally disturbing. "Who are you?" Marcus demanded, grip tightening on his trekking poles. Shadowfoot stood, no longer attempting to maintain the pretense of a normal hiker. "Someone who understands what the trail truly is," he replied. "Not just a footpath, but a threshold between worlds. You sensed it too, why else attempt to walk its entire length?" For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The usual birdsong and breeze-rustled leaves fell silent, as if nature itself was listening to their exchange. Marcus took an involuntary step backward, feeling the boundary between rational fear and something more primal dissolving. "The Appalachian Trail has its own guardians," Shadowfoot continued, his voice changing subtly, resonating with something ancient. "We watch those who walk between the worlds, especially those with the sight." "The sight?" Marcus echoed weakly. "You've seen things others miss, spirits at dusk, movements in stone circles, patterns in the mist. I've read your journal entries when you sleep. You're more receptive than most." Shadowfoot smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp. "Some hikers just walk the path. Others, like you, begin to see what dwells alongside it." The realization swept through Marcus like a flash flood, The strange lights he'd dismissed as fatigue, the whispers he'd attributed to wind, the persistent feeling of being watched that had begun long before Shadowfoot appeared. He wasn't being stalked by a man. He was being evaluated by something using a man's shape. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. Shadowfoot's form seemed to waver slightly, like heat rising from summer pavement. "You have a choice," he said. "Leave the trail forever, return to your world, and forget what you've glimpsed. Or continue north, with open eyes, and learn what the Appalachian Trail has been trying to show you across 500 miles of forests and mountains." Around them, the woods had grown impossibly still, a held breath waiting for Marcus's decision. The path stretched before him, winding into shadow and light, suddenly much more than a simple hiking trail connecting Georgia to Maine. The wind screamed across the white mountains like a blade, carrying snow that sliced exposed skin into angry red welts. Jake Mercer pulled his frost-crusted scarf higher, squinting through the wide-out conditions that had descended without warning 3 hours earlier. What had started as a challenging winter section hike along New Hampshire's presidential range was quickly becoming a survival scenario. The February expedition, for experienced hikers attempting a 3-day traverse, had seemed ambitious but manageable when they started under clear skies that morning. "We need shelter," shouted Elaine, her voice barely audible above the howling gale. Her typically composed demeanor had cracked, revealing the fear beneath. "The temperature's dropping too fast." The group huddled behind a granite outcropping, their breath crystallizing instantly in the Arctic air. They had planned to reach the Lakes of the Clouds hut by nightfall, but the sudden storm had disoriented them completely. The GPS was dead, batteries failed in the extreme cold, and the trail markers had disappeared under the rapidly accumulating snow that came down like a funeral shroud across the landscape. "Map says there's an emergency shelter 2 miles northeast," said Marcus, the most experienced mountaineer among them. His fingers trembled as he traced the route with numb fingertips. "If we can make it there before dark, we'll survive the night." The fourth member of their party, Devin, hadn't spoken in nearly an hour. His movements had become sluggish, his eyes distant, the beginning stages of hypothermia that none of them acknowledged aloud. The unspoken truth hung between them. They were in serious trouble. Jake shouldered both his pack and part of Devin's gear. "We move now or we die here," he said simply. The words fell heavy as stones in the alpine silence that momentarily replaced the wind's fury. They pressed forward through snowdrifts that reached mid-thigh, each step requiring twice the energy of normal hiking. The tree-line had disappeared hours ago, leaving them exposed on the ridge where the wind gathered speed and malice. Time stretched and compressed strangely in the white void, minutes feeling like hours, yet darkness approaching with terrifying speed. "Listen," Marcus suddenly hissed, raising his hand to halt the group. They froze, straining to hear through the storm's wail. At first, Jake heard nothing but the endless keening of wind through rocks. Then it came again, a sound that didn't belong to the mountain. A long, undulating cry echoed across the ridge, neither fully human nor recognizable as any animal Jake knew. It vibrated through his chest cavity and settled at the base of his spine like ice water. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Coyote," Elaine offered quickly, too quickly. "Maybe a wolf." Marcus shook his head slowly. "There are no wolves in the Whites anymore. Not for 100 years. Devin suddenly stirred from his near catatonic state. "Wendigo," he whispered, the word visible in the frozen air between them. His eyes were suddenly clear and focused on something beyond the curtain of snow. "My grandmother told me stories. The winter cannibal spirit. It calls with a human voice before it hunts." "We don't have time for that nonsense," Jake snapped, though he couldn't stop the crawl of primal fear up his neck. "The shelter is our only chance." As if responding to Jake's dismissal, the cry came again, closer now and unmistakably mimicking human tones, a wordless call of distress that triggered every protective instinct. It sounded like someone in pain, someone needing rescue. "Someone else is out here," Elaine said, starting to move toward the sound. Marcus grabbed her arm with unexpected force. No. Whatever that is, it's not human. His face, normally logical and mathematical in its expressions, showed raw fear. My uncle was Abenaki. He wouldn't even say the name of what makes that sound. The light was fading rapidly now, the blue-white snow darkening to steel gray. Jake's watch read 4:17 p.m. Night in the winter mountains was absolute and unforgiving, a darkness that consumed everything. They had perhaps 30 minutes before navigation became impossible. The shelter, Jake insisted again, orienting himself with the compass that swung wildly in his shaking hands. We stick together. We don't stop. We don't answer anything we hear. But as they resumed their desperate trek, Jake couldn't shake the sensation that they were being watched, that something ancient and patient had awakened in the storm and marked them. The wilderness around them had transformed from a challenging playground into a primordial realm where humans were once again prey, small and vulnerable against forces they pretended to have conquered long ago. Behind them, almost lost in the wind, came the soft, deliberate sound of footfalls in the snow. Something was following their trail. The emergency shelter appeared as a dark smudge against the white void just as true darkness began to swallow the mountains. A simple three-sided structure with a slanted roof, it offered minimal protection but represented their only chance of surviving the night. The temperature had plummeted to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill pushing it far lower, deadly conditions even for properly equipped hikers. Get Devin inside first, Jake ordered, helping the semi-conscious man through the shelter's low entrance. Inside, they found the remains of an old fire ring and a stack of emergency firewood, damp but potentially burnable if they could generate enough initial heat. Elaine worked quickly, setting up their single-burner camp stove to melt snow for water while Marcus dug through his pack for the emergency medical kit. Jake positioned himself at the shelter's open side, staring into the gathering darkness, listening. The strange crying had stopped, but the silence felt even more threatening. We need to barricade this opening somehow, he said quietly. Use the snowshoes and trekking poles to create a frame, then my extra tarp as a door. Marcus looked up from where he was checking Devin's pulse. You think something's out there? Besides the storm? Jake hesitated. He was an environmental science teacher, a rational man who believed in measurable facts and logical explanations. Yet 20 years of backcountry experience had taught him to respect the inexplicable elements of wilderness, the moments when scientific understanding faltered against older truths. I think we're not alone on this mountain, he finally answered. And I think we should act accordingly. They constructed a makeshift door and started a small, precious fire using hand sanitizer as an accelerant. The flames cast distorted shadows across the shelter's interior, turning familiar faces into grotesque masks. Devin's condition stabilized somewhat with warmth and hydration, though his eyes remained unnervingly alert, constantly fixed on the improvised door. My grandmother said they were once human, he murmured when the fire was at its brightest. People who committed the ultimate taboo during starvation winters. The spirit of hunger enters them, transforms them. They grow tall and gaunt. Their hearts turn to ice. They can never be satisfied. Save your strength, Elaine admonished, though her scientific skepticism had visibly eroded during the day's ordeal. The night deepened around their fragile shelter. The storm began to abate around midnight, leaving an eerie, muffled silence broken only by the occasional crack of branches under the weight of new snow. Jake maintained watch while the others fell into exhausted sleep, their bodies pressed together for warmth around the dwindling fire. The first scratching sound came at 2:17 a.m., a light, deliberate rasping against the outer wall of the shelter. Jake's hand tightened around the hunting knife he'd extracted from his pack. The scratching moved slowly around the perimeter, pausing occasionally as if testing for weaknesses. Then it stopped at the tarp door. Jake held his breath, every muscle coiled in anticipation. The silence stretched unbearably until a new sound emerged, the soft, deliberate inhale of something scenting the air, drawing their scent deep into ancient lungs. The tarp bulged slightly inward as something pressed against it. Then came the voice, a perfect mimicry of Elaine's panicked cry from earlier that day. "We need shelter," it called, the inflection eerily identical yet fundamentally wrong, like a digital recreation missing some essential human quality. Jake felt Marcus stir beside him, jolted awake by the familiar voice. Their eyes met in the ember's glow, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Whatever was outside wasn't Elaine, who still slept fitfully at their feet. "Jake? Marcus?" The thing called again, now perfectly imitating Devon's voice. "Let me in. I'm freezing out here." Jake placed a warning hand on Marcus's arm, shaking his head fractionally. The temperature inside the shelter had dropped dramatically, their exhaled breath now hanging in clouds around their faces. The dying embers of their fire dimmed further, as if something was drawing the heat away. The scratching resumed, more insistent now. Claws or fingers, Jake couldn't tell which, began systematically testing the shelter's construction, searching methodically for structural weaknesses. The sound moved up to the roof, where snow slid away under something's weight. Devon awoke with a strangled gasp. "It's here," he whispered, his eyes wide and reflecting an orange glow that didn't come from their nearly extinguished fire. "It's hungry!" A deep crack splintered the night as one of the shelter's support beams gave way under sudden pressure. Snow cascaded through the new gap in the roof, along with something else, a long, skeletal limb too pale and too articulated to be human, ending in elongated fingers tipped with what looked like yellowed bone. The hand retreated instantly when Jake lunged forward with his knife, leaving behind 5 puncture marks in the packed snow where the fingers had pressed. The holes sizzled faintly, as if the snow was being cooked from within. "We need to move," Jake hissed urgently. "Now. It's testing us, looking for weakness." "Move where?" Marcus demanded. "We're miles from anywhere in a whiteout, better than waiting to be." Jake's retort died as a new sound cut through the night. The wet, unmistakable noise of jaws opening wide, a sound that carried the impossibility of a mouth unhinging beyond natural anatomy. From directly above them came a deep, rattling inhalation, the breath of something that had once been human but had long ago surrendered its humanity to survive an unendurable winter. The presence loomed above their fragile shelter like a collapsing star, radiating a cold that went beyond physical sensation and into the realm of existential dread. As the roof began to splinter further, Jake made a desperate decision. He grabbed the camp stove's fuel canister, struck a match, and shouted, "Outside now!" They burst through the tarp door into the night just as Jake tossed the flaming canister into the shelter behind them. The explosion was small but fierce, igniting the remaining wood and sending a plume of fire and smoke into the darkness. A shrieking wail, not of pain but of rage, tore through the night as they plunged into the snowdrifts and ran blindly into the forest below. Whatever had been on the roof was momentarily disoriented by the flames, giving them precious seconds to put distance between themselves and the burning shelter. Jake led them downhill through the tree line where branches might offer some concealment, though he knew they were leaving clear tracks in the fresh snow, a trail that anything could follow. The night had cleared somewhat, revealing a nearly full moon that transformed the snow-covered landscape into a realm of blue shadow and silver light. Against this backdrop, Jake caught a glimpse of something standing by the burning shelter, a silhouette too tall and too thin, its proportions distorted beyond human possibility, antler-like protrusions rising from its elongated head. "Don't look back," he commanded when Elaine began to turn. "Keep moving. The trail crosses a stream half a mile down. We need to reach water." "Why water?" Devon gasped, stumbling between Marcus and Jake. "Old stories," Jake replied grimly. "Some things can't cross running water. Worth trying." They half ran, half slid down the mountainside, following what Jake hoped was the path to Ammonoosuc Ravine. Behind them came the sound of pursuit, not the crashing progression of a large animal, but something more deliberate and controlled. Branches snapped in rhythm like footsteps, always maintaining the same distance. It was toying with them. Each time they paused to catch their breath or check direction, the sound stopped precisely. When they moved again, the pursuit resumed at exactly the same pace. The strategy was clear: exhaust them completely, Let hypothermia and fatigue do the initial work, then close in when resistance would be minimal. Predator behavior, Marcus whispered during one brief pause. It's hurting us. Jake nodded grimly. But it doesn't know where we're going. The ranger station is 3 miles down this ravine. If we reach it before dawn, what makes you think dawn matters? Devin interrupted, his voice stronger now, fueled by a strange, fatalistic energy. The Wendigo isn't bound by daylight. It hunts until it feeds. A branch snapped loudly just 20 yards behind them, much closer than the previous sounds. Their pursuer was accelerating, abandoning its psychological game for direct action. The hunt was entering its final phase. Run, Jake ordered, no longer concerned about conserving energy. Don't stop for anything. They crashed through the forest, abandoning any pretense of stealth. Jake's lungs burned with each breath of frigid air, his legs trembling with exertion after the day's ordeal. He could hear Elaine whimpering with each stride, the sound perilously close to the cries of fear their pursuer had mimicked earlier. The forest suddenly opened before them, revealing the dark ribbon of Amanus Extreme, partially frozen but still flowing strongly in the center. Beyond it lay their only chance, the steep climb to the ranger station where emergency supplies, a radio, and solid walls awaited. Cross here, Jake shouted, plunging into the icy current that reached mid-thigh. The cold was immediate and shocking, driving the air from his lungs. He turned back to help the others across the slippery rocks. Behind them, at the forest's edge, stood the thing they had been fleeing. In the moonlight, its form was both distinct and impossible, a towering figure with the general shape of a human but stretched to grotesque proportions. Its ribs pressed visibly against gray, desiccated skin stretched over a frame that must have stood 9 feet tall. The head was the most horrifying element, part human skull, part deer, with massive antlers extending toward the night sky like a crown of bones. It stood watching them, steam rising from a mouth that seemed to open vertically rather than horizontally. Its eyes reflected the moonlight like an animal's, twin points of hunger fixed unblinkingly on the group as they struggled across the stream. The morning mist hung low over the remote trail deep in the Allagash wilderness of northern Maine as Elise Parker set up her tripod. At 41, she had spent over 20 years photographing wildlife in some of the most isolated places on Earth. But this assignment felt different. National Geographic had commissioned her to document the elusive eastern mountain lion, an animal officially declared extinct yet rumored to still roam these forests. 6 days into her 3-week expedition, Elisa's camera trap had captured nothing but common woodland creatures, deer, raccoons, the occasional moose. She adjusted the settings on her Nikon D850, her fingers working mechanically while her mind drifted. The isolation had begun to feel heavier than usual. Normally, solitude in the wilderness energized her, but something about this stretch of forest felt watchful, as if the trees themselves tracked her movements. A blue jay's harsh call shattered the silence, making her flinch. She chided herself for being jumpy. This was exactly the kind of behavior that prevented most people from experiencing true wilderness. The sun climbed higher as Elise hiked deeper into the forest, following game trails and checking her previously placed camera traps. By midday, she had reached her most remote setup, nearly 8 miles from her base camp. As she approached the camera, something seemed off. The device had been moved, angled slightly downward rather than parallel to the ground as she had positioned it. Puzzled, Elise scanned the surrounding area. No signs of large animals disturbing it. No storm had passed through. Someone, or something, had touched her equipment. "Hello?" she called out, her voice swallowed by the density of the forest. Only the whisper of pine needles stirring in the breeze answered back. She quickly checked the memory card, scrolling through the images. Deer, squirrel, fox, darkness, and then a blur. Something large and indistinct had triggered the motion sensor at 3:17 a.m. The timestamp made her skin prickle. She enlarged the image, but could make out only a smeared shape, like wet clay molded into something almost human but not quite right. Walking back to camp that afternoon, Elise felt it for the first time, the unmistakable sensation of being followed. Like a shadow that refuses to appear when you turn to look for it, the presence remained just beyond the periphery of her awareness. The forest seemed to grow quieter with each step, the natural ambient sounds dropping away until all she could hear was her own breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. And just on the edge of perception, something else. A mirroring crunch, falling exactly in rhythm with her steps, then pausing when she paused. Back at her small tent, Elise meticulously checked her camp's perimeter. Nothing disturbed, nothing out of place. As darkness fell, she built her fire larger than usual, the flames leaping high, creating a barrier of light against the pressing darkness. She reviewed the day's photographs on her laptop, trying to focus on work rather than the growing unease that had settled over her like a cold mist. Later that night, sleep eluded her. Every snap of a twig, every rustle outside her tent sent adrenaline coursing through her veins. Around 2 a.m, Elise bolted upright at the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling her tent, deliberate, heavy, yet somehow wrong in their rhythm. They stopped directly outside the entrance. Her flashlight revealed nothing when she finally gathered the courage to look. The perimeter of undisturbed pine needles around her tent confirmed that nothing physical had approached, yet she had heard it with absolute clarity. At dawn, Elise discovered the first clear evidence. In the soft earth near the creek where she collected water, a single footprint, too large for a human, with strange elongations where toes should be, pressed nearly 2 inches into the mud. Her camera clicked rapidly as she photographed it from every angle, measuring its dimensions against her own hand. 17 inches long. No known animal in these woods made tracks like this. The implications sent ice water through her veins, but the photographer in her overtook the fear. This could be her most important discovery yet. Dawn broke with reluctance on the 8th day of Elise's expedition, gray light seeping through a thick blanket of fog that had descended overnight. The revelation of the strange footprint had transformed her mission. No longer simply searching for mountain lions, she now meticulously documented evidence of whatever shared these woods with her. Her rationality battled with growing dread as she established new camera traps specifically to capture her mysterious follower. The isolation that had initially unsettled her now felt dangerous. She tried using her satellite phone to contact her editor, but the connection had failed repeatedly, unusual, even in these remote conditions. Her messages remained unsent, digital ghosts trapped in the device. Elise found herself talking aloud, partly to maintain sanity, partly to announce her human presence to whatever lurked at the edges of her camp. "I know you're there," she called out that morning, her breath visible in the chill air. "What are you?" Only the dripping of condensation from pine boughs answered her. That day, she deliberately created a routine, leaving camp at precisely 9 a.m. and following the same route to check her cameras. The footsteps behind her began almost immediately, matching her pace but stopping whenever she turned. Once, she spun around so quickly she nearly lost her balance, but caught only a dark movement dissolving behind a massive oak, like smoke being pulled into invisible vents. By the third camera trap, Elise's hands trembled as she removed the memory card. The previous night's images loaded onto her field tablet, revealing nothing unusual until 2:43 a.m. The sequence made her breath catch. Something tall moved through the frame, its form indistinct but undeniably bipedal. The next shot showed only blackness, as if the creature had detected the camera and covered the lens. The final image made her nearly drop the tablet, a close-up of what could only be described as a face, but wrong in ways her mind struggled to process. Features stretched and misaligned, eyes set too far apart, reflecting light like a nocturnal animal's. Rushing to her last camera, Elise found it mangled, its metal casing twisted and the memory card missing. The destruction required strength no human could easily muster. Her scientific detachment began crumbling under the weight of primal fear. A career built on documenting the natural world had not prepared her for something that defied natural explanation. That evening, huddled in her tent with her equipment packed for a possible emergency departure, Elise reviewed all her evidence. The footprint photos, the blurred images, her audio recordings, which captured nothing but forest sounds and her own voice, yet when played at half speed revealed something else beneath. A low, rhythmic sound that might have been breathing or words in some unrecognizable language. Sleep came in fitful bursts, each awakening bringing the same awareness, the thing outside, circling closer each time. The temperature dropped dramatically around midnight, her breath forming ice crystals on the inside of the tent. The footsteps came again, but different now, dragging slightly, as if the creature were injured or changing its approach. At 3:17 a.m., the exact time stamp from her first disturbed camera, something brushed against the tent fabric, a prolonged contact that traced the entire perimeter of her shelter. Elise lay frozen, camera clutched to her chest, as the zipper of her tent slowly, impossibly, began to open from the outside. The harsh scream of a nearby hawk jolted Elise awake just before sunrise. She sat up with a gasp, disoriented and trembling. Had she dreamed the tent zipper opening, the approaching footsteps? The canvas remained securely fastened, showing no signs of disturbance. Outside, early morning mist clung to the pine trees, transforming the forest into a ghostly cathedral. But something else had changed. The ever-present sensation of being watched had intensified overnight, pressing against her awareness like a physical weight. With methodical precision born from years of fieldwork, Elise documented everything as scientific evidence rather than letting fear overtake reason. She photographed a series of broken branches forming a rough perimeter around her campsite, all snapped at exactly the same height, 7 feet above the ground. Near her fire pit, the ashes had been disturbed, arranged into a crude pattern that resembled no animal tracks she recognized. Most disturbingly, her own boot prints from the previous evening disappeared halfway between her tent and the creek, as though something had meticulously brushed away all traces. "I need to understand you," Elise said aloud, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She set up her tripod in the center of camp, attaching motion-sensitive triggers to capture a 360-degree view. If the entity approached again, she would have evidence from every angle. Throughout that day, Elise stayed within sight of her camp, photographing the surrounding forest with hyper-focused attention. Every shadow, every unusual configuration of branches became potential evidence. The scholarly part of her brain cataloged possibilities: an undocumented predator, an elaborate hoax, her own mounting psychological stress manifesting as paranormal perception. Yet none fully explained the footprints' impossible dimensions or the face caught on camera. By mid-afternoon, she'd discovered a pattern in the disturbances. They formed a spiral centering on her camp, widening outward like ripples in still water. At the outer edge of this spiral, nearly a mile from her tent, Elise found a clearing she hadn't noticed before. The vegetation there had been systematically bent and woven into arch-like structures too deliberate to be natural, too complex to be human-made without tools. Standing beneath the largest arch, she felt a vertical displacement in the air, as if gravity itself wavered slightly. Her satellite phone suddenly chirped to life in her pocket, the first signal in days. Before she could dial out, a text message appeared from an unknown number. "You see it too?" The phone died immediately after, battery drained to zero despite being fully charged that morning. Racing back to camp as sunlight faded, Elise felt the footsteps behind her grow bolder, no longer matching her rhythm but establishing their own, faster, closing distance. Twice she pivoted, camera raised, but captured only the swaying of branches where something had just passed. The forest itself seemed to bend around a presence that refused to be seen directly, like light curving around a massive gravitational object. Reaching her tent as darkness fell, Elise found her equipment untouched but rearranged, the cameras aimed inward, focused on her sleeping area. On her laptop, impossibly, a new folder had appeared containing hundreds of images she never took, close-ups of her sleeping face from the previous 3 nights, taken from inside her tent when she had no camera set up. The timestamps showed they were captured every 3 minutes, with mechanical precision, throughout each night. Sleep was unthinkable now. Elise built her fire high and positioned herself in the center of her camera array, determined to witness whatever approached. Around midnight, the forest fell into unnatural silence. Even the night insects ceased their chorus. The temperature plummeted until her breath clouded before her. The fire, though well fed with dry wood, dim to barely glowing embers despite no wind to explain its sudden failure. Then, at the edge of the firelight, movement, not from one direction, but from all sides simultaneously. The cameras triggered in rapid succession, their flashes briefly illuminating segments of the forest in strobing bursts. In those fragmentary glimpses, Elise saw them, tall, attenuated forms moving with fluid grace between the trees, never fully revealed in any single flash but undeniably present in the negative spaces between light and shadow. Her scientific mind made one last attempt at rationality, cataloging what she observed: their height at least 7 feet, their number at least 5, their movement pattern coordinated, intelligent. But when what appeared to be elongated fingers reached into the dying firelight from multiple directions simultaneously, rational thought surrendered to instinct. Elise bolted for the only direction without movement, leaving her equipment behind. The forest seemed to rearrange itself as she ran, familiar landmarks appearing in impossible locations. The footsteps behind multiplied, no longer concealing their presence, gaining with each stride. When she glanced back, her headlamp illuminated multiple sets of eyes reflecting green-gold light at different heights, some near the ground, others impossibly high among the branches. Elise's flight ended abruptly at the edge of a small pond she had never encountered before, though she had mapped every water source within miles. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting stars that didn't match the night sky above. The footsteps converged behind her, surrounding completely now. With nowhere left to run, Elise turned to face what followed, camera raised in trembling hands, her last act of documentation. The final image recovered from Elise Parker's camera 3 weeks later shows only darkness framing a bright, doorway-shaped light. Park rangers found her campsite undisturbed, as if she had simply vanished mid-expedition. Her laptop contained thousands of images, most conventional wildlife photographs, but the final folder required specialized software to decrypt. Those images, analyzed by multiple experts, defied conventional explanation and remained classified. The only public statement released about Elise's disappearance referenced unusual geological anomalies in the area where she vanished. To this day, hikers report hearing phantom footsteps on that isolated stretch of trail, always behind them, matching their pace perfectly, stopping when they stop, but never revealing their source, no matter how quickly one turns to look. Deep in the Appalachian wilderness, where the fog clings to ancient trees like ghostly shrouds, 4 friends embarked on what should have been a routine weekend hike along Blood Mountain's notorious trails. Maya, the seasoned hiking expert with 3 Appalachian Trail completions under her belt, led the group with confident strides. Behind her followed Damon, a skeptical graduate student researching Appalachian folklore, Eliza, a photographer hunting for the perfect woodland shot, and Jared, Maya's boyfriend who'd rather be anywhere else but had come along to please her. None of them could have anticipated that the mountain earned its ominous name for reasons beyond the rust-colored soil that stained its slopes. The October morning had greeted them with perfect hiking conditions, crisp air, clear skies, and the forest canopy ablaze with autumn colors. Their plan was simple, a 3-day loop starting from the Neels Gap trailhead, summiting Blood Mountain by nightfall, then continuing along the ridge before circling back. The first 5 miles passed uneventfully, filled with casual conversation and periodic stops to admire particularly stunning vistas. Maya pointed out various plants of interest, while Eliza captured the light filtering through crimson leaves. The forest breathed around them, peaceful and predictable. What shattered this tranquility wasn't a sound but an absence, the sudden, unnatural silence that descended as they approached a clearing not marked on any of their maps. Birds ceased their calls, insects fell quiet, and even the constant whisper of wind through leaves stopped abruptly. The air grew heavy, thick with an acrid smell that burned their nostrils. "Something's dead nearby," Damon muttered, but Maya shook her head. This wasn't the familiar scent of natural decay but something chemical, artificial, and distinctly wrong. The clearing revealed itself like an infected wound in the forest's flesh. A perfect circle approximately 30 feet in diameter, its perimeter defined by scorched earth where nothing grew. Within this barren space stood 7 crude stone pillars arranged in a precise geometric pattern, each standing about waist high and covered in symbols that resembled no known alphabet. At the center lay the remains of a recent fire, ashes still warm to the touch despite the morning dew that had settled everywhere else. Surrounding the fire pit, strange patterns had been drawn in what appeared to be a dark, rust-colored substance. Eliza raised her camera instinctively but lowered it just as quickly. "I can't," she whispered. "It feels invasive somehow." Jared, typically the first to crack jokes, remained uncharacteristically silent as he circled the perimeter. His foot knocked against something partially buried in the disturbed soil, a small, handcrafted doll fashioned from twigs and what looked disturbingly like human hair. The craftsmanship was intricate, almost beautiful in its detail, with tiny features etched into a wooden face and arms bound with red thread. Maya's extensive wilderness experience offered no explanation for what they'd found. The arrangement was too deliberate, too precise to be the work of casual campers or vandals. Damon, despite his academic skepticism, felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. "This is ritualistic," he said quietly, kneeling to examine but not touch the symbols carved into the nearest stone. "These markings combine elements from several traditions. I recognize fragments of Celtic knots, but there's something else. Older." His fingers hovered over one particular symbol that seemed to shift slightly when viewed from different angles, as though it existed in more dimensions than the stone it was carved upon. What happened next would become a point of contention between them for months afterward. A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, though the surrounding trees remained eerily still. The ashes from the fire pit rose in a spiral, dancing in the air like dark snowflakes before settling again. And for a brief moment, so brief that each would later question if they'd actually seen it, the shadows cast by the stone pillars appeared to bend toward them, stretching impossibly against the angle of the sun. Then everything returned to normal, except for the inescapable feeling that they were now being watched by something hidden just beyond their peripheral vision. "We should go," Maya stated firmly, her usual confidence faltering. No one argued. As they hurriedly gathered their gear, Eliza's camera switched on by itself, the shutter clicking rapidly though no one's finger was near the button. The display screen showed only darkness despite the bright daylight. And as they left the clearing, each felt an almost physical resistance, as if the air itself tried to hold them back, a membrane they had to push through before the forest sounds gradually returned, washing over them like a wave of relief. But something had changed. Something had noticed them. And as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they couldn't shake the certainty that they were no longer alone on Blood Mountain. The hiking party pushed forward along the trail, eager to put distance between themselves and the disturbing clearing. The late afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to follow their movements a fraction too slowly. Conversation had died, replaced by the mechanical rhythm of boots on dirt and the occasional clink of metal carabiners against water bottles. Maya consulted her GPS unit repeatedly, its screen flickering between normal readings and inexplicable errors. Their planned campsite was still 3 miles ahead, but the consensus without discussion had become clear. They needed to reach it before darkness fell completely. Damon broke the silence first, his academic mind wrestling with what they'd witnessed. "Those symbols," he said, voice hushed despite the empty trail around them. "They contained elements from multiple occult traditions, mixed in ways that shouldn't make sense together. It's like someone combined different magical languages into a new syntax." Nobody responded immediately. The academic analysis felt flimsy against the visceral wrongness they had all experienced. The forest grew darker as clouds gathered overhead, unnaturally fast, swallowing the remnants of daylight. What should have been a 30-minute weather change happened in moments, turning mid-afternoon to dusk prematurely. A cold wind rushed through the canopy, carrying whispers that sounded almost like voices, not words exactly, but patterned sounds with the cadence of speech. Eliza tried again to use her camera, hoping to capture the strange cloud formation, but found the battery completely drained despite having charged it fully that morning. "Did anyone else hear that?" Jared asked suddenly, stopping in his tracks. When the others looked confused, he pointed back down the trail. "Someone calling my name." They listened, but heard nothing beyond the rustle of leaves and distant thunder. As they resumed walking, each began experiencing similar auditory hallucinations, their names carried on the wind, spoken in voices that sounded vaguely familiar yet impossible to identify. Like childhood memories half forgotten. The temperature dropped precipitously. Their breath formed clouds in the suddenly frigid air, and frost began crystallizing on leaves despite it being early October. Jared checked his phone's thermometer, 28 degrees Fahrenheit and falling rapidly. "This isn't natural," Maya muttered, her outdoor expertise offering no explanation for such dramatic weather shifts. As if in response, a low vibration traveled through the ground beneath their feet, subtle at first but growing stronger until small stones danced on the trail's surface. They reached a stream crossing that appeared on none of their maps. The water ran black despite its apparent clearness, like liquid shadow rather than actual water. When Damon cautiously dipped his hiking pole into it, the metal tip emerged dry. "We need to turn around," he said, but when they looked back, the trail they'd followed had vanished, replaced by dense underbrush as if it had never existed at all. The forest had rearranged itself around them, herding them forward as the only available option. As twilight deepened into true darkness, their headlamps created cones of light that seemed to penetrate only a few feet before being swallowed by an unnatural blackness. Objects at the periphery of their vision moved independently of the wind, branches reaching slightly, rocks shifting position when attention drifted away from them. The wildlife had gone completely silent except for a rhythmic thumping sound that followed them, always just far enough away to be indistinct. Like a massive heartbeat pulsing through the forest floor. Eliza noticed it first. Their shadows were moving incorrectly, lagging behind movements by fractions of seconds as if reluctant to follow. When they stopped completely, the shadows continued subtle, independent motions, a finger twitching, a head slowly turning. Maya reached for her water bottle and froze as her shadow's hand made the gesture before she did. The implications paralyzed them all momentarily. "Don't look at them," she whispered, voice cracking. "Just keep moving." Eventually, they stumbled upon a small cave entrance, offering shelter from the increasingly hostile environment. Inside, they huddled together, setting up emergency bivouacs without discussion. None wanted to articulate the obvious. Blood Mountain was responding to their intrusion at the ritual site. As Jared unrolled his sleeping bag, something fell from its folds, an identical twig doll to the one they'd seen earlier, though none of them had taken it. When he reached for it, the doll's tiny wooden arms moved, fingers curling inward as if grasping at the air. Eliza screamed, the sound echoing through the cave and returning altered, multiplied, as if many voices had joined hers from the darkness beyond their lights. That night, though none could truly sleep, they each experienced the same dream, standing again in the ritual circle, but now completed with themselves as the final components. In this shared nightmare, they understood the purpose of the ceremony, a door being opened, reality thinning to allow something ancient passage back into the world. And most disturbing of all, they recognized that their accidental discovery hadn't interrupted the ritual. Their presence had completed it, serving as the final catalyst needed. As midnight approached in both dream and reality, the stones in the clearing began to glow with internal fire, and the seventh pillar, previously empty, now bore fresh carvings, their names, written in a language none of them knew but all somehow understood. The night proved endless in that small cave on Blood Mountain. What should have been 8 hours of darkness stretched impossibly as their watches and phones displayed contradictory times, some freezing completely, others racing forward then backward in defiance of physics. The batteries in their headlamps dimmed then brightened without pattern, casting grotesque shadows that moved independently along the rough stone walls. Sleep came in short, terrifying bursts for each of them, always accompanied by the same collective dream, the ritual circle calling them back, the ceremony continuing despite their absence. Morning arrived without the usual gradual lightening of the sky. One moment complete darkness enveloped them. The next, gray dawn light filtered into the cave entrance, as if someone had flipped a switch. They emerged cautiously, disheveled and exhausted, to find the forest transformed. The previously vibrant autumn colors had drained away, leaving trees that appeared desiccated though still bearing leaves. The sounds of the forest had returned, but wrong somehow. Birdsong played backward, wind that seemed to carry fragmented voices. "We need to get off this mountain," Maya stated with renewed determination, studying her backup paper map since all their electronic devices had either failed completely or displayed impossible readings. The descent route should have been straightforward, following a well-established trail for 6 miles to the forest road where they'd parked. But each path they attempted somehow curved back toward the summit despite their careful attention to compass bearings. The mountain seemed determined to prevent their departure, manipulating geography through means they couldn't comprehend. Midday found them standing at an overlook they'd never seen before, staring at impossible topography. The valley below contained structures that shouldn't exist, stone monoliths identical to those in the clearing but massive in scale, hundreds of feet tall, arranged in patterns that hurt the eyes to follow. When Jared blinked and looked again, the vision vanished, replaced by normal forest. But everyone had seen it. The boundary between worlds was thinning around them, reality becoming permeable. The ritual wasn't finished. Damon finally verbalized what they'd all been thinking. Whatever was started there, our presence somehow catalyzed it. And now it's... He trailed off, lacking vocabulary for what was happening. The clearing had been a focal point, the epicenter of something vaster than they could grasp, and they had inadvertently stepped into an ongoing process, becoming components rather than mere observers. As afternoon stretched on, physical laws began deteriorating further. Gravity weakened momentarily, causing them to float inches above the ground before crashing down again. Light bent around objects, creating prismatic halos and afterimages that lingered minutes after looking away. Most disturbingly, time itself seemed to stutter, moments repeating like skipping records, others expanding into excruciating duration where seconds felt like hours. Their perception fragmented, consciousness struggling to maintain cohesion as reality itself became unreliable. Trees began weeping a thick, amber substance that hardened instantly upon exposure to air, creating bizarre sculptural formations that resembled reaching figures frozen in mid-emergence. The ground beneath their feet softened periodically, revealing glimpses of something moving beneath the soil, vast networks of root-like structures that pulsed with bioluminescent light. When darkness finally began falling again, they realized with horror that the stars overhead were arranging themselves into the same patterns they'd seen carved into the stones at the clearing. Desperate and terrified, they made a decision born of pure survival instinct, to return to the ritual site, hoping that completing the circle might somehow reverse what they'd set in motion. The forest seemed to approve of this choice, paths suddenly opening before them where there had been none before. As night fell completely around them, they found themselves standing once again at the edge of that perfect clearing, now transformed. The 7 stone pillars glowed with internal fire, casting long shadows that moved independently of the light source. The symbols carved into them had changed, evolved into more complex configurations that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly. And there in the center stood what they had been avoiding acknowledging, a door where no door should exist, a perfect rectangular opening hanging in empty air, framing absolute darkness. A darkness that was not merely the absence of light but something active and aware. As they stood transfixed at the threshold of understanding, a voice spoke from within that impossible doorway, not in sound waves that disturbed the air, but directly into their minds. It spoke their names with perfect pronunciation, including fragments of identity even they had forgotten. And it thanked them, with terrible politeness, for their assistance in the ritual at Blood Mountain. The threshold had been crossed. The invitation delivered. And now, it explained with almost tender patience, it would show them wonders and horrors beyond human comprehension, as was their right as unwitting celebrants. The darkness within the doorway extended tendrils toward them, not threatening but welcoming, like a host ushering honored guests inside. Behind them, the forest of Blood Mountain waited, sealed off from the world they had known, transformed into the antechamber of something vast and ancient that had been waiting centuries for precisely this moment. The morning light crept through the thin walls of the tent, warming the sleeping bags where Maya and Ethan lay, their bodies curled against the autumn chill of the Appalachian Mountains. They had started their 10-day hiking trip 3 days ago, escaping Boston's concrete and deadlines for the wilderness of the trail. Maya woke first, her eyes adjusting to the golden glow, feeling a strange, lingering unease from a dream she couldn't quite remember. Outside, the forest was alive with birdsong and a gentle rustle of leaves. "Coffee first, then we break camp," Ethan mumbled, reaching for her hand in the semi-darkness. Their morning routine was already well established: boil water on the tiny camp stove, pack their belongings with practiced efficiency, check the trail map. Today they would cover 12 miles, reaching the famous lookout point by sunset if they maintained a steady pace. They were folding the tent when they heard footsteps approaching. A tall figure emerged from the tree line, moving with the easy grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness. He wore a faded red backpack that seemed too small for a long journey, and his boots, though well-worn, looked oddly unsuitable for the rocky terrain. His smile was immediate and warming, like finding an unexpected fire on a cold night. "Morning, fellow travelers," he called, his voice carrying across the clearing. "James Blackwood, heading north." His handshake was firm, his eyes a striking pale blue that seemed to catch all available light. Maya felt an immediate connection, the way you sometimes do with strangers who don't feel strange at all. Ethan, usually more reserved with new people, found himself smiling back. James asked about their route, nodding appreciatively at their plans. "Mind if I join you for today? I've been hiking alone for 3 days, and honestly, I'm starved for conversation." There was something in the way he asked, confident yet humble, as if he would completely understand a refusal. But neither Maya nor Ethan wanted to refuse. The day unfolded in easy miles and easier conversation. James told them he was a botanist studying rare plant species along the trail. His knowledge was impressive, pointing out tiny flowers Ethan had never noticed, explaining how certain fungi formed symbiotic relationships with tree roots beneath their feet, networks of living communication spreading unseen below the forest floor. When they stopped for lunch at a popular rest area crowded with other hikers, James produced a small bag of wild berries. "Perfectly safe, I promise," he laughed, noting Maya's hesitation. "My grandmother was half Cherokee. She taught me which plants feed you and which plants kill you." The berries burst with sweetness unlike anything from a grocery store, like tasting the mountain itself. Other hikers nodded politely as they passed, but no one engaged with their group. It struck Maya as odd, given how friendly trail culture typically was, but James's stories were so captivating she soon forgot about it. He described distant countries he'd visited, stars viewed from deserts so remote they had no names, ancient trees that had stood witness to centuries of human history. His words painted pictures so vivid Maya could almost see these places herself. That evening, as they set up camp near the lookout point, James built a fire with practiced hands. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face, making him seem both younger and impossibly old at the same time. "You know," he said quietly, "people think they come to these mountains to find solitude, but I think they're really searching for connection, to something larger than themselves." Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. James's words echoed something he'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. How did this stranger understand so precisely what had drawn them here? When Maya invited James to continue with them tomorrow, Ethan found himself relieved. There was more to learn from this man, something important waiting just beyond the next ridge, the next conversation. As they settled into their tent that night, Maya whispered, "He's fascinating, isn't he?" Ethan agreed, though a small, nagging thought troubled his mind. At the crowded lunch spot, he couldn't recall seeing James interact with anyone else. In fact, thinking back through the day's encounters on the trail, he realized something peculiar. Not once had another hiker acknowledged James's presence, even when he stood directly in their path. But exhaustion claimed Ethan before he could puzzle it through, drawing him down into dreams of ancient forests and paths that led both forward and back. Dawn broke clear and cold the second day, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. James was already awake, tending a small fire with coffee nearly ready. He seemed to materialize supplies from his modest pack, Today it was fresh blueberries and a small jar of honey for their oatmeal. "Nature's bounty," he said with that same warm smile that now felt as familiar as an old friend's. They hiked through terrain that grew increasingly dramatic, sheer cliff faces to their right, deep valleys falling away to their left. The trail narrowed in places, forcing them to walk single file, James taking the lead with a confidence that inspired trust. He knew every turn of the path without consulting a map, pointing out landmarks before they appeared: a lightning-struck tree, a peculiar rock formation shaped like a sleeping bear, a hidden spring bubbling up between moss-covered stones. Maya noticed how the daylight played differently around James. Sometimes the sun seemed to shine through him rather than on him, creating an odd halo effect that disappeared when she looked directly at it. She dismissed it as a trick of the forest light, filtered through leaves and reflected off streams. Yet something was shifting in her perception of their companion. Not fear, exactly, but wonder tinged with uncertainty. At midday, they encountered a park ranger checking permits. Ethan and Maya produced theirs, but before they could explain about James, the ranger looked right past him, asking, "Just the two of you heading to Blackwater Ridge?" Ethan turned, expecting James to present his own permit, but their companion was examining a cluster of mushrooms several yards away, apparently uninterested in the interaction. "Yes, just us," Maya replied automatically, then frowned at her own words. Why had she said that? James was standing right there, visible to anyone with eyes. Yet the ranger hadn't acknowledged him, hadn't even glanced in his direction. When she tried to mention James afterward, the words stuck in her throat, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming desire to discuss the weather. That afternoon brought rain, a gentle, misty drizzle that beaded on their jackets and dampened the forest floor. James seemed unaffected, his clothes barely showing moisture while Ethan and Maya grew increasingly damp. Walking beside him, Ethan caught the scent of pine and wood smoke, though they hadn't passed a campfire for miles. "The rain speaks if you listen closely enough," James said, his voice blending with the patter of droplets on leaves. "Each drop carries stories from the clouds, from the distant oceans where it began its journey." The way he described it, the rain became a cosmic conversation, the forest its attentive audience. Ethan found himself listening differently, hearing rhythms and patterns where before there had only been random noise. They made camp earlier that evening, finding shelter beneath a rocky overhang. As darkness settled around them, James produced a small flute from his pocket and played melodies that seemed both foreign and hauntingly familiar. The music twined with the diminishing rainfall, creating harmonies that made Maya's chest ache with emotions she couldn't name. "My ancestors believed music opens doorways," James explained during a pause, the flute resting lightly in his hands. "Not just between people, but between worlds." His eyes reflected the firelight like twin stars, impossibly bright in the gathering dark. "Some doorways remain open longer than others, while some close forever once you've passed through." Later, lying awake in their tent, Ethan whispered, "Have you noticed anything strange about James?" He described his observations, how no one else seemed to see or interact with their companion, how he appeared to know the trail intimately despite claiming this was his first visit, how his small pack somehow contained whatever they needed. Maya was quiet for so long Ethan thought she'd fallen asleep. Finally, she said, "I saw his footprints disappear today. We were crossing a muddy patch, and his steps left no marks, while ours sank deep into the earth." She turned toward Ethan in the darkness. "But I'm not afraid of him. Are you?" The third morning dawned with fog so thick they could barely see 10 feet ahead. Their campsite seemed suspended in a cloud, disconnected from the world below. James appeared through the mist like a figure stepping through a veil, carrying fresh spring water in a container either of them remembered him having. "Perfect day for ghost stories," he said with a wink, helping them break camp with practiced efficiency. There was something different about him today, a slight transparency around his edges, as if he were fading into the fog itself. When Ethan reached to take a cup from him, their hands passed through each other momentarily. The sensation wasn't cold as stories might suggest, but warm like sunlight through water. Neither Ethan nor Maya mentioned the incident. Some truths are too fragile for words, existing only in the shared glance they exchanged afterward. They continued hiking, the fog occasionally parting to reveal spectacular views before closing around them again. James's stories took on a more personal tone that day. He spoke of loves lost to time, of witnessing forests grow from seedlings to ancient groves, of watching civilizations rise and crumble. "The thing about time," he said as they rested beside a mountain stream, "is that it's not the straight line most people imagine. It folds back on itself, creates pockets and eddies where moments can stretch into eternities." His voice had taken on an echo quality, as if coming from somewhere much further away than the rock where he sat. By afternoon, they reached Blackwater Ridge, their destination before turning back tomorrow. The fog had lifted, revealing a panoramic view of valleys and distant peaks. Other hikers milled around the popular viewpoint, taking photos and consulting maps. A couple offered to take Ethan and Maya's picture, positioning them against the spectacular backdrop. "Could you include our friend too?" Maya asked, gesturing to where James stood slightly apart, gazing out at the horizon. The woman looked confused. "What friend? It's just you two up here." She glanced around, her expression concerned. When Maya turned back, James was watching them with a gentle smile. He inclined his head slightly, as if confirming what they already suspected. That evening, their last with James, they camped in a secluded clearing away from the other hikers. The night sky opened above them, stars crowding the darkness like diamond dust scattered across black velvet. James named constellations unknown to modern astronomy, describing them as old friends he visited throughout the centuries. "Not everyone can see me," he said finally, addressing what they hadn't asked. "Only those at certain crossroads in their lives, people who need to remember something they've forgotten about themselves." "What have we forgotten?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. James studied them both, his form now distinctly luminous in the firelight. "That you are more than the lives you've constructed. That the boundaries between what is and what could be are thinner than you imagine." He gestured toward their entwined hands. "That what you found in each other is rarer and more precious than either of you have allowed yourselves to believe." Maya felt tears on her cheeks, though she wasn't sad. Are you dying?" James laughed, the sound rippling through the darkness like water over stones. "I've never been alive in the way you understand life. I am a memory of this place, a story the mountains tell themselves." His form wavered like a reflection in disturbed water. "By morning you'll be alone again, but not really. Some companions never truly leave." The sky over the Appalachian Mountains had turned a deep indigo as Marcus Elliott prepared his camera gear at McAfee Knob. The famed rocky outcrop jutting from the mountainside was Virginia's most photographed spot, but Marcus wanted something different, a time-lapse of the Milky Way arching over the iconic ledge. He checked his watch, 11:30 p.m. Perfect timing to capture the celestial show before moonrise. The late October air carried a bite that penetrated his layers, but the cloudless conditions promised spectacular results. He heard voices before he saw their flashlights, a young couple making their way up the final stretch to the knob. Marcus nodded a greeting as they passed, their excitement palpable despite the late hour. "We'd never get a chance to see the place empty during daylight," the woman explained, her breath clouding in the chilly air. They continued toward the outcropping, leaving Marcus to his equipment setup. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. Marcus finished mounting his camera and programming the intervalometer. Each minute, the shutter would open, capturing the heavens in their slow dance across the night. He settled into his camp chair, wrapped in a thermal blanket, content to wait while the camera performed its automated ballet. The first scream sliced through the darkness like a knife, so human and yet so primal that the hair on Marcus's arms instantly stood on end. A woman's voice, unmistakable terror. His head snapped toward the knob where the couple had disappeared. The scream came again, followed by a man's shout, words indistinguishable but tone clear: panic. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and sprinted toward the outcropping, heart hammering against his ribs. "Hello?" he called, scanning the area with his beam. Are you okay? The knob appeared empty, the famous ledge deserted. But then came another sound, not a scream this time, but a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to emanate from the very rock beneath his feet. At the edge, he saw them, the couple, clinging to a narrow ledge about 15 feet below the main outcropping, their faces pale ovals in his flashlight beam. Something pushed us, the man gasped, clutching his girlfriend who was sobbing uncontrollably. We weren't even near the edge, I swear. The rescue took hours. Marcus had no cell service, forcing him to leave the couple with his extra layers and hike back to the nearest emergency phone. By the time search and rescue arrived, the couple's hypothermia had set in, their stories becoming increasingly disjointed. The woman kept muttering about eyes in the mountain, and something that wasn't there then was. Park rangers attributed the incident to carelessness at a dangerous overlook, despite the couple's insistence that they were standing several feet from the edge when they felt hands on their backs. Marcus said nothing about the growl he'd heard, convinced it was just the wind playing tricks or his imagination heightened by adrenaline. He collected his abandoned equipment the next day, surprised to find the camera had continued its programmed sequence throughout the night. It wasn't until a week later, reviewing his footage frame by frame, that Marcus noticed something that turned his blood cold. Just before the timestamp matching the first scream, a shadow moved across the knob that couldn't be explained by clouds or wildlife. Frame by frame, the amorphous darkness seemed to coalesce, stretching upward like smoke, forming a humanoid figure, before dispersing in the next frame. Marcus might have dismissed it as a camera glitch if not for what followed. 3 separate hikers reported hearing screams in the same area over the next month. 2 described feeling watched. 1, an experienced backpacker, abandoned his through hike of the Appalachian Trail altogether after spending a night near McAfee Knob, refusing to elaborate except to say the place was wrong. By December, when the season's first heavy snow blanketed the mountains, the stories might have been forgotten, relegated to campfire tales and hiker gossip. But that's when geology student Amara Wilson made a discovery that would transform idle speculation into something far more disturbing. While cataloging rock formations along the Appalachian Trail for her graduate thesis, she found something in the undercut of McAfee Knob that defied conventional explanation. Markings that were neither natural erosion patterns nor modern graffiti, but something far older and more deliberate, hidden from casual observation for centuries. And when she placed her digital recorder near the markings to document her findings, the playback captured something that shouldn't have been possible, sounds that weren't present during the recording. Voices speaking words in no known language, punctuated by the same deep, resonant growl that Marcus Elliott had convinced himself he never actually heard. The discovery drew little attention at first, just another curious anomaly in a mountain range full of mysteries and folk legends. But that changed when Amara's findings crossed the desk of Dr. Eleanor Marsh at the University of Virginia's Department of Anthropology. Dr. Marsh had spent decades studying indigenous sites throughout the Appalachian region, and something about the markings photographed by Amara struck a chord of recognition. The symbols Amara documented matched fragments found in only one other location, a sealed cave system in West Virginia that had been ceremonially avoided by local tribes for generations. According to the limited oral histories Dr. Marsh had gathered, these markings served not as communication but as warnings, boundaries between the world of humans and something else entirely. When Dr. Marsh arrived at McAfee Knob in early January, the temperature had plummeted to record lows. The famous outcropping stood deserted, a sentinel of stone against the winter blue sky. Perfect conditions, she thought, for a proper examination without the interruption of the usual hiking crowds. She'd brought specialized equipment, ground-penetrating radar, high-resolution cameras with various light filters, and audio equipment far more sensitive than Amara's simple recorder. What she couldn't have anticipated was the weather's sudden turn. The clear sky darkened within minutes, bringing not snow but a dense, unnatural fog that seemed to rise from the valley floor like a living entity. Through the swirling white, visibility dropped to mere feet. Dr. Marsh's equipment began malfunctioning, first the radar, then the cameras, finally even her satellite phone. Alone on the mountain with no communication and no clear path down, Dr. Marsh did what any scientist would do. She continued her work. Setting up floodlights powered by portable batteries, she created a small island of illumination in the engulfing fog and began documenting the markings beneath the outcrop. The temperature continued to drop, and the silence grew heavier, broken only by the scratch of her pencil in her field notebook. The first whisper came just after sunset, so faint she thought she'd imagined it. But the second was unmistakable, her name, spoken directly behind her, though when she turned, her lights revealed nothing but swirling mist. The third whisper came from another direction entirely, then another, until it seemed she was surrounded by disembodied voices calling her name from every angle. In the beam of her headlamp, the markings on the rock face began to change. What had been static symbols now seemed to shift subtly, reconfiguring themselves into new patterns that hurt her eyes to follow. The stone beneath her fingers, previously cold and inert, now felt warm, almost pulsing, as though something vast and ancient was stirring beneath the mountain's surface. Dr. Marsh was a scientist to her core, trained to observe and document rather than flee. But when the fog between her and the trail suddenly parted like a curtain, revealing a clear path downward, she recognized it for what it was, not coincidence, but invitation. The mountain wanted her gone. She gathered her equipment with trembling hands, abandoning the heavier pieces in her haste. The voices had stopped, but something worse had replaced them, a profound silence that felt like a hell breath, the quiet of a predator waiting to strike. As she stumbled down the trail, the fog closed behind her, erasing her path, forcing her forward and only forward. Park rangers found Dr. Marsh the next morning at the trailhead, equipment scattered, field notebook clutched to her chest, pages filled with frantic notations that became increasingly illegible. Her final entry, written in a hand so shaky as to be barely recognizable, contained just 4 words. "The mountain is awake." The incident might have ended there, another unexplained occurrence in a place known for strange happenings. But Dr. Marsh's recordings, recovered from the equipment she'd abandoned on the mountain, contained something that couldn't be dismissed. Beneath the static and distortion, audio analysts identified what they called non-random acoustic patterns, sounds that exhibited the mathematical structure of language, but matched no known tongue, ancient or modern. More disturbing still were the spectrograms generated from these recordings. When visualized, certain sound patterns formed shapes identical to the markings found beneath the outcropping, as though the voices themselves were somehow etching symbols into the air. Scientists from 3 universities attempted to explain the phenomenon through natural acoustics or technical glitches, but none of their theories could account for the correlation between sound and symbol. By spring, McAfee Knob had developed a reputation. Tourist numbers dropped despite the prime hiking season. Those who did venture to the famous overlook reported nothing unusual during daylight hours. But as sunset approached, many described an increasing sense of being unwelcome, of being watched by something ancient and patient. Local authorities, concerned about the impact on tourism, attempted to debunk the growing rumors. They pointed to natural explanations: wind through rock formations creating unusual acoustics, mountain lions accounting for screams, pareidolia explaining perceived patterns. Yet they couldn't explain why 3 separate search and rescue dogs refused to approach certain areas near the knob, or why electronic equipment consistently malfunctioned in specific locations. In late April, a team of geologists conducting a routine survey made perhaps the most significant discovery yet. Deep beneath the surface, accessible through a narrow fissure that had previously gone unnoticed, they found a chamber that couldn't exist according to all previous mappings of the area's cave systems. And on the walls of this chamber, illuminated for the first time in perhaps millennia, were hundreds upon hundreds of markings, identical to those found under the knob, but vastly more extensive, covering every available surface in patterns that seemed to flow and shift in the beam of their lights. One geologist described it as, "like looking at a language that's alive." Another refused to enter the chamber at all, claiming the air inside felt heavy with intention. Their equipment recorded temperature fluctuations that defied explanation, dropping to near freezing before rising rapidly to well above the ambient temperature, cycling in patterns that, when graphed, created yet more symbols. The chamber was sealed pending further investigation, but hikers continued to report strange occurrences, equipment failures, unexplained sounds, and most commonly, an overwhelming sense of being observed by something ancient and aware. Rangers installed monitoring equipment at various points along the trail, hoping to capture evidence that might explain the phenomena. What they recorded instead only deepened the mystery. Motion-activated cameras showed nothing unusual, yet repeatedly activated at precisely the same times each night. Audio equipment captured whispers at the threshold of human hearing that, when amplified and cleaned, contained distinct patterns similar to Dr. Marsh's recordings. And most inexplicably, seismic sensors detected subtle vibrations emanating from deep within the mountain, vibrations that couldn't be attributed to known geological processes. The vibrations followed patterns too regular to be natural, yet too complex to be man-made. When analyzed against linguistic algorithms, these patterns showed structural similarities to human language, pauses corresponding to sentence breaks, repeating elements suggesting words or phrases, variations that could indicate questions or commands. The dense canopy of oak and maple trees above the Appalachian Trail near Mount Rogers, Virginia, cast dappling shadows on the forest floor as Jake Harrison checked his GPS coordinates for the third time. The reading didn't make sense. According to his device, he was standing halfway up Whitetop Mountain, but the terrain around him matched nothing on his topographical map. A cold breeze swept through the trees, carrying with it a silence that seemed too complete for these woods. The birds had stopped singing, the insects had ceased their constant humming, and even the wind through the leaves had taken on a hollow quality that made the hair on Jake's neck stand at attention. He had been hiking this section of the trail since he was 12, but something felt fundamentally wrong about where he stood. The trail beneath his feet was still marked with the familiar white blazes, yet they seemed fresher, almost glowing against the bark. Jake had entered a morning fog bank about a mile back, and when he emerged, the forest had changed in ways he couldn't immediately identify. The trees were the same species, but their arrangement fell off, as if viewed through a carnival mirror. A rock formation that should have been to his right now loomed to his left. The sun, though hidden behind clouds, cast light from what seemed to be the wrong direction entirely. Jake took a deep breath and felt the air fill his lungs with something that tasted metallic, ancient. Pressing forward, Jake spotted a figure standing about 50 yards ahead on the trail. Relief washed over him. Another hiker could help orient him, or at least confirm he wasn't losing his mind. But as he approached, the figure remained motionless, its back to Jake, wearing what looked like outdated hiking gear, heavy wool and leather rather than the modern synthetic materials most trail enthusiasts favored. "Hello?" Jake called out. The figure tilted its head at an unnatural angle but didn't turn. When Jake blinked, the figure was gone, leaving only a swirl of mist where it had stood. That's when Jake knew with certainty. He wasn't on the Appalachian Trail, he knew. He was somewhere else, somewhere that wore the face of familiar places but twisted them into something unfamiliar. Panic began to set in as Jake turned to retrace his steps. The trail behind him no longer matched what he had just walked. Landmarks had shifted again, trees seemed to have changed positions, and the trail itself now curved where it had previously run straight. A small stream bubbled nearby, one that wasn't on any map and hadn't been there minutes earlier. The water ran clear but seemed to flow uphill in defiance of natural law. Among the rocks beside the stream, Jake spotted something white, a crumpled piece of notebook paper, surprisingly dry despite its proximity to water. Unfolding it revealed a hastily written message. "If you're reading this, you've stepped sideways too. Find the oak with the double blaze. Walk through, not around. Don't look back at the watchers." Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as he read the last line. The watchers, was that what he had seen on the trail? Stuffing the note into his pocket, he scanned the forest around him. Between the trees, at the limits of his vision, shadows moved in ways shadows shouldn't. They seemed to pause when he focused on them directly, resuming their silent observation when he looked away. They lingered at the edges of clearing, gathered in clusters near rocky outcroppings, standing sentinel-like among the thickest parts of the forest. Not people, not animals, something untethered from classification. For hours, Jake searched for the oak with the double blaze mentioned in the note. The forest grew darker despite no change in the cloud cover, as if light itself was being gradually withdrawn from this place. His watch had stopped working, the GPS continued showing impossible coordinates, and his phone displayed no signal. Jake's mouth grew dry as he realized that if night fell while he remained in this twisted version of Appalachia, he might never find his way back. The trees seemed to crowd closer, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers toward the trail. And all the while, the watchers kept their silent vigil, their presence felt rather than seen, patient as mountains and just as implacable. Jake came to a fork in the trail that shouldn't exist. To his left, the path continued with white blazes that seemed too bright, too perfect. To the right, a narrower trail led into thicker woods with normal-looking trail markers. As Jake stood paralyzed by indecision, he noticed movement from both directions, more watchers, closing in with deliberate slowness. And between the trees ahead, something else moved, something that walked like a person but wasn't quite right in ways Jake's mind refused to process. His choice now seemed obvious. Jake turned and ran. The forest grew denser as Park Ranger Michelle Cowan reviewed the latest missing persons report on her tablet. Jake Harrison, experienced hiker, had failed to check in at his scheduled time 3 days ago. This wasn't unusual on its own. Hikers often deviated from plans or faced delays. But Jake's case was the 5th this month in the same 10-mile stretch of the Appalachian Trail, and the similarities between reports had triggered an alert in their system. Each missing hiker had last been seen entering a section near Wytop Mountain in conditions of light fog or mist. 2 had been found wandering miles off trail, dehydrated and disoriented, with no memory of how they'd gotten there. The other 2 remained missing. Michelle parked her truck at the Damascus trailhead and shouldered her pack. This wasn't an official search. That would come tomorrow if Jake didn't turn up, but something about these incidents scratched at the back of her mind. She had grown up in these mountains, spent 20 years as a ranger here, and knew every switchback and wildlife pattern. The mountains held many dangers, sudden weather changes, wildlife, treacherous terrain, but they had never felt malevolent until recently. Something had changed in these woods, and the stories from the hikers they'd found only deepened her unease. The recovered hikers described similar experiences: disorientation in fog, landscapes that shifted position, trails that led in impossible directions. One woman, a geology professor from Asheville, had broken down during her interview, insisting she'd walked the same quarter-mile for nearly 6 hours without reaching its end. Another described people, watching from between trees, figures that moved only when not directly observed. Both had eventually stumbled across what they described as a tear, or thin spot, places where the normal trails suddenly reappeared. The professor had mentioned finding a note similar to the one in Jake's pocket, though she hadn't been able to produce it as evidence. Michelle had dismissed these accounts as trauma responses, the mind creating narrative from the confusion of being lost. But now, as she hiked the empty trail with afternoon shadows stretching across her path, doubt crept in. The forest seemed too quiet, the shadows between trees too deep. She had hiked past the first area where a hiker had gone missing and was approaching the section where Jake had last pinged his location app. A light mist had begun to form between the trees, not unusual for these elevations but unsettling given the pattern in the reports. Michelle paused to check her radio, still clear, with a strong signal back to headquarters. Her GPS showed her position accurately on the trail map. The mist thickened suddenly, swirling around her boots and climbing like spectral fingers up her legs. Within seconds, visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. Michelle reached for her radio to report the condition change, but the device emitted only static. Her GPS screen flickered, then displayed coordinates that placed her 20 miles from her actual location. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature worked its way down her spine as she recalled the recovered hiker's stories with new understanding. Was she experiencing the same phenomenon? The mist continued to thicken, but instead of the gray-white of normal fog, It took on a faint bluish tinge that cast an eerie glow over the trail ahead. Michelle forced herself to think rationally. She marked her current position by tying a bright orange surveyor's flag to a branch. If the stories were true, the landscape might change around her, but having fixed points could help maintain orientation. She took a compass reading, noting that the needle swung erratically before settling on a direction that contradicted her map. Fear bubbled up inside her, but Michelle pushed it down with the discipline of 2 decades of wilderness experience. There were always explanations for strange occurrences in nature, unusual magnetic anomalies, weather phenomena, even the mind playing tricks. Yet, as she continued cautiously down the trail, the fixed points she marked seemed to move. Flags she'd placed only minutes before appeared on the wrong side of the trail, or vanished entirely. The trail itself began to change. What had been a well-maintained path now appeared overgrown in spots, as if rarely traveled. In other sections, it widened beyond normal parameters or narrowed almost to invisibility. Rock formations appeared where none had been before. A small shelter, not marked on any trail map, stood weathered and abandoned beside the path. Michelle approached it carefully, searching for any sign of Jake or the other missing hikers. Inside, she found a logbook with entries dating back decades, some written in ink that had long since faded to near invisibility. The most recent entry was dated yesterday, but the handwriting changed halfway through, becoming increasingly frantic and eventually dissolving into jagged lines that tore through the page. As Michelle backed away from the shelter, movement caught her eye. Between distant trees, figures stood watching. Not hikers, they were too still, too attentive in their silence. When she turned to face them directly, the spaces between trees appeared empty. But when she looked away, the watchers returned to the periphery of her vision. Were these the same entities the hikers had described? Michelle fought against rising panic as she realized the sun was beginning to set. Night in this wrong version of Appalachia was not something she wanted to experience. She needed to find a way back, or at least locate Jake and any others who might be trapped here. Jake Harrison stumbled through the underbrush, his clothes torn and dirty from hours of desperate flight through the altered landscape. He had long since abandoned the trail, finding that the watchers seemed less numerous away from the established path. His water was almost gone, his food supplies dwindling, and exhaustion clouded his thinking. Night had fallen once already during his ordeal, a night unlike any he'd experienced, where darkness had physical weight and sounds came from nowhere and everywhere. He had huddled beneath a rock overhang as shapes moved through the trees, some walking on 2 legs, others crawling close to the ground, all avoiding his small fire as if the light pained them. Morning had brought no relief. The sun rose from what Jake was certain was the west, casting shadows that stretched in impossible directions and sometimes moved independently of their sources. He had found other signs of hikers, a dropped water bottle, a torn backpack strap, a single boot, but no people. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. Was he the only one currently trapped in this sideways Appalachia? The note he'd found suggested others had passed through before, but had they escaped or simply vanished? Jake pushed that thought away as he spotted something through the trees ahead, a clearing he hadn't noticed before, and in it, a figure that moved with purpose rather than the eerie stillness of the watchers. Cautiously approaching, Jake recognized the uniform of a park ranger. Relief washed over him so strongly that his knees nearly buckled. "Hello," he called, his voice hoarse from disuse. The ranger turned, revealing a woman's face, weathered but alert. She didn't disappear like the figure on the trail had. She was real. Jake rushed forward, words tumbling out about his experience, the note, the watchers, the night. The ranger, Michelle, according to her nameplate, listened with mounting concern rather than disbelief, which told Jake she had experienced enough to know he wasn't delusional. She showed him her own discoveries, the moving trail markers, the compass that couldn't settle on north, the shelter with its disturbing logbook. "We need to find the oak with the double blaze," Michelle said after Jake showed her his crumpled note. "I've seen a few trees with markings that don't match standard trail blazes. One of them might be what we're looking for." As they compared their experiences, a pattern emerged. The rules of this place were not completely random. The landscape shifted most dramatically during transitions, dawn, dusk, or when fog rolled in. The watchers never approached direct light, whether sunlight or artificial. And most importantly, others had found ways out, which meant escape was possible if they could decipher the clues left behind. They set out together, marking their path with Michelle's remaining surveyor flags while searching for the distinctive oak mentioned in the note. The forest around them continued its subtle shifting, trees rearranging when not directly observed, landmarks migrating across the landscape like slow ships. They discovered other notes along the way, tucked into tree hollows or wedged between rocks. Each contained fragments of information. Count 7 steps from the split stone before turning. The moon shows the true path, not the sun. They can't cross running water, but the streams move too. Most disturbing was one that simply read, "They were people once. Don't let them touch you." As afternoon faded toward another terrifying night, they spotted it, an ancient oak with 2 white blazes painted vertically instead of the standard horizontal marking. Unlike the other trail markers, these didn't glow with unnatural brightness. They looked weathered, normal. Jake and Michelle approached cautiously, studying the area around the tree for any sign of what "walk through, not around" might mean. The trunk was massive, impossible to walk through in any literal sense. Jake circled it once, finding nothing unusual except that the watchers had begun to gather in greater numbers at the edge of visibility, as if aware that their potential prey had found something significant. Michelle ran her hand along the bark and stopped suddenly at a section that looked solid but felt different. "Here," she whispered. "It looks solid, but my hand." She pressed against the bark, and her fingers passed through what appeared to be solid wood as if through water. A chill rippled across the surface like pond disturbance. Jake stared in disbelief as Michelle pushed her entire arm through the trunk, her limb disappearing up to the shoulder into what should have been solid oak. Behind them, the watchers had drawn closer, no longer hiding their approach. Dozens of them moved through the trees with deliberate slowness, human-shaped but wrong and subtle, nauseating ways that the mind rejected. "We have to go now," Jake said, his voice tight with fear as he watched the approaching figures. "Walk through, not around." Michelle nodded and, with one fluid motion, stepped entirely into the tree. She vanished before Jake's eyes. The watchers broke into sudden, silent movement, abandoning their slowness for a terrible speed. Jake didn't hesitate. He lunged forward into what looked like solid wood, feeling a moment of cold resistance like pushing through ice, then a sensation of falling sideways rather than forward. There was a moment of absolute darkness, of pressure from all sides, of voices whispering in languages that had no name. Then Jake fell forward onto normal trail dirt, Michelle beside him, both gasping for breath beneath an ordinary oak tree with standard trail blazes. Their GPS devices displayed correct coordinates. Radio signals came through clear. The forest around them held the normal sounds of birds and insects. They had returned, or perhaps they had never left, merely stepped sideways for a time into something that occupied the same space but existed just out of phase with the reality they knew. They found a search party less than a mile down the trail, already looking for both of them. Jake had been missing for 4 days, Michelle for just over 24 hours. The mountains of eastern Tennessee loomed ahead, their ancient silhouettes cradled against the morning sky. 5 friends, Mia, Jackson, Layla, Kai, and Diana, piled out of their weathered Subaru, stretching limbs grown stiff from the 3-hour drive from Nashville. They'd been planning this 3-day trek through a remote section of the Smoky Mountains for months, a chance to escape screen-lit lives and reconnect with something authentic, something real. None of them could have anticipated that the mountains had been waiting for them, too. "Weather report says clear skies all weekend," Jackson announced, strapping his backpack in place with practiced efficiency. The others nodded approvingly, breathing in the pine-soaked air that already felt like freedom. Diana, the most experienced hiker among them, studied her topographical map one last time before tucking it into her pocket. The trail had beckoned, a narrow mouth disappearing into thick green woods that seemed to swallow light. The first mile passed in cheerful conversation, discussions about work frustrations and relationship dramas floating away behind them like autumn leaves on a stream. Layla, a meteorologist at the local news station, kept glancing skyward at the cloudless expanse stretching above them. "Perfect conditions," she remarked, though something in her voice carried a note of uncertainty. The weather had been behaving strangely all season, but today seemed almost suspiciously ideal. By noon, they'd climbed to a rocky outcropping that offered a panoramic view of wave after wave of mountains fading into bluiting distance. They paused for lunch, legs dangling off the edge of stone worn smooth by millennia of rain and wind. Kai, always the quiet observer, noticed it first, a tendril of what looked like smoke or mist, threading its way through a valley far below. "What's that?" he asked, pointing. The others followed his gaze, squinting against the sunlight. "Probably just morning fog being burned off," Mia suggested, though the afternoon sun had long since reached its zenith. Still, they thought little of it as they continued their ascent, unaware that the mist was not dissipating but rather gathering strength, coiling through the valley like a patient predator. 2 hours later, they reached their planned camping spot, a small clearing near a bubbling creek with flat ground perfect for pitching tents. As they began setting up camp, Jackson grew increasingly concerned about Diana, who'd been uncharacteristically quiet for the past hour. "You feeling okay?" he asked, finding her staring into the dense forest with an expression he couldn't quite read. She startled at his voice. "Something feels off," she whispered. "Like we're being watched." The others dismissed her concern as typical woods-induced paranoia, the natural discomfort of city dwellers suddenly confronted with true wilderness. But as dusk approached, the temperature dropped with unusual swiftness, and a silence settled over the forest, not the normal quiet of nature, but something deeper, as if even the insects and birds had retreated into hiding. The fire they built seemed to struggle against the darkness, its flames flickering uncertainly. And then it came, not from the horizon or down from the mountains, but seeping up from the ground itself. A mist that moved against the wind, against all natural patterns. It rose in tendrils at first, weaving between trees and curling around their ankles with deliberate slowness, as if tasting them. The group huddled closer to the fire, watching with growing unease as the fog thickened, obscuring the forest until their clearing became an island in a white sea. "This isn't normal," Layla said, her scientific mind struggling to categorize what her senses were telling her. The mist didn't drift or flow, it moved, purposefully, intelligently, like thousands of probing fingers reaching toward them. And just when they thought it couldn't become more unsettling, they began to hear it, a sound so faint they strained to be certain it was real. A whispering, not of wind through leaves, but of something alive, conscious, hungry. Words almost recognizable but slipping away before meaning could form. Kai stepped forward, reaching out a hand toward the wall of mist that now surrounded their camp. "Don't," Diana warned, but it was too late. The fog surged forward, engulfing his arm, then his body, pulling him into its embrace like a lover reunited. The last thing they saw was the expression of wonder on his face turning to horror before he vanished completely into the white. The remaining 4 friends leapt to their feet, calling Kai's name into the impenetrable curtain of fog. But the only response was the faint echo of their own voices, and something else, a scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, Kai's voice distorted by distance, or by something worse than mere separation. In that moment, they realized with bone-deep certainty that whatever this mist was, it had been following them all along. Waiting. And now, one by one, it would reveal to each of them the nightmares lurking within its mysterious depths. Jackson was the first to break the paralysis gripping them. "We need to find him," he said, voice cracking. "Now." He grabbed a flaming branch from the fire and plunged into the fog before anyone could stop him, disappearing as completely as Kai had moments before. In the sudden silence that followed, Mia, Layla, and Diana huddled together, trapped between the dying fire and the living mist that seemed to breathe with ancient patience. Mia's hand shook as she clutched her phone, the screen showing no signal. "What is happening?" she whispered, though none of them had answers. The fog pressed closer, testing their boundaries, and within its shifting mass, they began to see shapes, not just random patterns, but deliberate formations that resembled faces, hands, figures walking. The longer they stared, the more distinct the apparitions became. Then came the voices, not the indistinct whispering from before, but clear, recognizable tones speaking names and secrets none of them had shared. "It knows us," Layla realized with growing horror. "Somehow it knows exactly who we are." The revelation hung in the air between them, more terrifying than the physical threat of the mist itself. Diana, still clutching her map as if it could somehow lead them out of this nightmare, suddenly gasped. The paper in her hands had begun to change, the familiar trails and topographical lines rearranging themselves into different patterns, paths that had never existed, leading to places marked with symbols she'd never seen before. "The map," she choked out. "Look at the map." But as Mia and Layla leaned closer, the mist surged forward with startling speed, engulfing Diana in seconds. Her scream was cut short, leaving only emptiness where she had stood. The map fluttered to the ground, now showing nothing but blank paper. Mia grabbed Layla's arm, fingers digging in with desperate strength. "We have to stay together," she insisted. "No matter what happens, we can't let it separate us." But as the words left her mouth, the fog between them thickened, becoming an impenetrable barrier. Layla's hand was torn from her grasp, and her friend's terrified face vanished behind the swirling white wall. Alone now, Mia felt the mist caressing her skin like ice-cold silk, invasive and intimate. She backed toward the dying embers of their fire, the last barrier between her and complete consumption. As the fog closed in, blocking out stars, trees, any sense of direction, she saw images forming within its depths, memories from her own life playing out before her, but twisted, altered. Moments of joy corrupted into scenes of horror. People she loved transformed into grotesque parodies of themselves. "It's not real," she whispered, though her certainty was fading. The fog had a presence, a weight against her mind that felt heavier than physical touch. It wanted something from her, from all of them. Not just fear, but something deeper. It was searching, probing, hungry for whatever lay beneath their surfaces. And as the last flame behind her sputtered out, Mia realized with stark clarity that the fog had not found them by chance. It had chosen them, lured them here, arranged every circumstance of their journey. The mist swirled faster now, eager in its approach, and as it engulfed her completely, Mia understood its final, terrible truth: it wasn't following them at all. They had been following it all along, drawn like moths to the promise of its ancient light. The revelation came with a flood of images too horrific to comprehend, visions of what awaited her friends, what awaited her, in the heart of the living fog. Her scream joined the others, already echoing within the mist's vast, hungry consciousness. The smoke that follows had claimed them all now, adding their stories to the thousands it had collected over centuries. And somewhere in the darkest valley of the mountains, it began to move again, searching for new travelers, new stories, new fears to consume. The morning hikers who would discover the abandoned campsite the next day would find nothing unusual, just empty tents and cold ashes. No sign of the five friends. No evidence of the horrors they had witnessed. Only a strange, lingering mist that seemed to retreat from the sunlight, biding its time until darkness fell once more. The worn leather journal was discovered by a search party 3 weeks after Thomas Caldwell went missing in Maine's 100-mile wilderness. Its pages, filled with increasingly frantic handwriting, have become the only clue to his disappearance. Park rangers had abandoned the search after 13 days, chalking up Caldwell's vanishing to the wilderness that has claimed hikers before. But the journal tells a different story, one that Maine authorities have dismissed as the ravings of a man suffering from exposure and dehydration. The entries begin normally enough: trail conditions, wildlife sightings, weather reports. Then, on day 7, everything changes. October 3rd, the rain hasn't stopped for 2 days. My Gore-Tex is failing, and everything I own is soaked through. The map shows no shelters for another 15 miles, but I can't continue like this. Hypothermia is a real concern now. I veered east at the creek crossing, hoping to find higher ground. That's when I saw it, a structure nestled between ancient pines, nearly invisible unless you were looking directly at it. A shelter not marked on any trail map I've studied. Strange that something so substantial would be omitted. It's built of massive logs darkened by what must be centuries of exposure, the roof constructed of layered bark and stone. Not the work of the Appalachian Trail Conference. This place feels older, much older. The shelter's interior smells of earth and time, like opening a forgotten chest filled with your grandfather's possessions. I've hung my soaked gear on crude pegs hammered into the walls. There's a stone circle for a fire in the center, but no smoke hole above it. The blackened ceiling suggests years of fires. Who built this place? The construction seems wrong somehow. The proportions are slightly off, as if designed for someone taller and thinner than a normal person. I'm just grateful to be dry. Night has fallen quickly. The rain drums against the roof with unusual intensity, creating patterns that sound almost like words in a language I can't quite grasp. I've attempted to mark my location on the map, but my GPS isn't working. Battery must be affected by the dampness. I'll conserve my phone battery and try again tomorrow. For now, I've built a small fire. The wood I gathered burns with an odd bluish tinge. October 4th. Slept better than expected despite strange dreams. In them, I walked forest paths that seemed to shift and change direction when I wasn't looking. The trees had faces, not in a cartoonish way, but subtle suggestions in the bark patterns that seemed to watch me pass. I woke several times thinking I heard movement outside the shelter. Probably deer or maybe a moose. The rain has stopped, but thick fog has settled in its place. Visibility is perhaps 20 feet. I'll wait for it to clear before moving on. The shelter's interior looks different in daylight. Carvings I missed last night cover the walls, intricate spirals and patterns that remind me of Celtic knotwork but more complex, almost mathematical in precision. Some look remarkably fresh while others are worn almost smooth. I've taken rubbings of several in my journal. The symbols form sequences that repeat with slight variations, like some form of communication or record-keeping. I've discovered a small opening in the back wall, partially hidden behind what I took for a sleeping platform. It leads to a second chamber I somehow missed last night. The space is perfectly circular, about 12 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling. The walls are covered in the same symbols, but more densely packed. In the center stands a stone column about waist high, its surface polished to a mirror finish. Not limestone or granite, something I can't identify. It's cool to the touch and seems to absorb rather than reflect light. The fog outside has thickened rather than dissipated. It presses against the shelter's small windows like something alive, seeking entry. When I tried to step outside to check conditions, the cold hit me like a physical blow. I retreated quickly. Something is off about this place. The proportions feel increasingly wrong, as if the dimensions are subtly changing. I keep catching movement at the edge of my vision, but when I turn, there's nothing there. Just the symbols on the walls, which seem to shift slightly when I'm not looking directly at them. I'm not typically superstitious, but I feel watched. Not by anything outside, but by the shelter itself, as if the structure is somehow aware of my presence. The rational part of my brain says it's just isolation and unusual surroundings affecting me. Yet I can't shake the feeling that I've stumbled into something ancient and patient, something that has been waiting a very long time. My dreams grow more vivid with each hour of sleep I steal in this place. I see forests primeval, untouched by human hands, and strange processions moving through moonlit clearings. Figures too tall and thin to be human, carrying lights that burn with that same bluish flame. They move toward this shelter, or what will become this shelter, bringing something to place upon the stone column. Something that pulses with its own inner light. The fog hasn't lifted, and the forest beyond the shelter has fallen utterly silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of animals moving through undergrowth. Just silence, pressing against my ears like cotton wool. I should leave, fog or no fog. Follow my compass east until I hit the Maine trail again. Yet something holds me here, curiosity, perhaps, or something less easily named. The stone column in the inner chamber seems to call to me, a silent invitation to touch its surface again. To press my palm flat against it and feel the subtle vibration beneath. I won't, of course. That way lies madness. But I find myself wondering what would happen if I did. What would I see? What would I know? The blue flamed fire has burned down to embers that refuse to die completely. Night has fallen again, though I hadn't noticed the transition. Time feels slippery here, inconsistent. My watch stopped at 3:17, the weather morning or afternoon I can't say. The battery is new, it shouldn't have failed. October 5th, I tried to leave at first light, but the forest has changed. The trees stand closer together than I remember, their trunks twisted into impossible shapes. The trail I followed here has vanished completely. I walked for what felt like hours, only to find myself circling back to the shelter each time. The fog remains, thick enough to cut with a knife, but now shot through with threads of iridescence that move like slow lightning. The inner chamber calls to me constantly now. The stone column no longer feels cool to the touch but warm, almost hot, like something newly wakened. The symbols on the walls definitely move when I'm not looking directly at them, rearranging into new patterns that seem increasingly urgent. They want to tell me something. They want me to understand. Last night, I dreamed I was not alone in the shelter. Something moved in the shadows of the inner chamber, tall and thin and patient as mountains. It spoke without words, communicating through impressions that bloomed directly in my mind. It showed me stars in configurations I've never seen, continents shaped differently than our own, oceans where now stand mountains. It showed me this place, this shelter, standing unchanged while forests grew and died around it, while glaciers advanced and retreated, while nations rose and fell beyond its walls. We were here before, it seemed to say, and we will be here after. I woke gasping, my hand pressed flat against the stone column, though I have no memory of entering the inner chamber. My palm burns like a brand where it touched the stone, the skin marked with a perfect spiral that seems to move slightly when I'm not looking directly at it. I feel changed, though I cannot say exactly how. The shelter is no longer merely a structure. It is a threshold, a boundary between what I have always known and something vast and ancient that exists alongside our world but separate from it. The being I sensed, the caretaker, as I've come to think of it, has been waiting for someone to cross that threshold, to understand what this place truly is. I believe now that this shelter was never built. It grew, or was called into being by something that needed a foothold in our world. The symbols are not decorations but a form of binding, holding the threshold in place. They're also an invitation, for those who can read them. Can I read them now? The spiral on my palm throbs in time with my heartbeat, and when I look at the walls, the patterns seem almost legible. 12 trails into darkness, 12 stories that will haunt your next hike. The Appalachian Trail holds many wonders, but as you've learned today, not all of them welcome human visitors. Subscribe now for more terrifying tales from the wilderness, and remember, when you're alone on the trail, you're never really alone.